Chapter 976 Array from the Moon. April 1st was a day with significant meaning for the lunar colony. Lu Fan looked up at the magnificent hemispherical building outside the colony, and there was admiration in his eyes. Power transmission to the Earth hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. In his mind, it was almost impossible to accomplish 2 months ago. However, at this moment, he didn't have any doubt that this project, a project that could be described as a miracle in the history of mankind, has been completed in their hands. The original hexagonal laser generator was wrapped in a giant hemisphere consisting of a hexagonal grid. These hexagonal grids are made of special materials. Under different conditions, it has variable transparency. According to the program, only one side of the hexagonal grids is transparent, and the other sides reflect all light. Lasers in different directions are constantly reflected throughout the sphere, and are eventually converged in one direction. Then, they are released at one point and directed at a specific point hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. This is the mechanism of the entire device. Under the precise control of the quantum computer, the direction of the beam is precisely controlled by changing the transparency of the hexagonal grid on the spherical surface. After all, this distance takes light even for a full second to travel. Any error will be infinitely magnified. The target that receives the laser is moving relative to the moon all the time, and only the quantum computer with astonishing computing power can take the helm of the project. Are you very surprised? The unshaven He Biao walked to Lu Fan's side and touched his own head that was about to bald. Then, he grinned. After a few days, I can return to Earth and I can brag to everybody that the life and death of Earth were under my control for a moment. Lu Fan laughed with him. The colonial supervisor said that there would be no problems even if it is shot on the Earth. It is true. He Biao also turned his eyes to the giant egg, grinning. But who cares when I am bragging? After hearing the irresponsible speech of his boss, Lu Fan smiled and shook his head. Suddenly, he realized a problem and frowned. What if another country gives us trouble with this problem? He Biao laughed and patted him on the shoulder. Then let them give us trouble. This is a national event, something not for the ordinary us to worry about. The sky is falling and there are dull people who will be hit first, let alone those who have already gone to heaven. There are a few days left before we change shifts. If I were you, I wouldn't be thinking about all this. You might as well think about how you should spend the money you have earned in the past 6 months when you go back. While the two chatted, in the colonial command room, Tang Weiji solemnly ordered the launch. Within the giant egg, the hexagonal base began to form a dark purple light visible to the naked eye. There were no specular light beams and there were no fancy effects. Everyone waited nervously for 3 seconds. 3 seconds later, a green signal light illuminated, and the command room erupted with cheers and whistles. Even Tang Weiji, who has always been calm, tossed his hat in the air. Just 3 seconds ago, or more precisely, exactly a little more than 2 seconds ago, the spectrometer next to the giant egg received a return light verifying that the laser hit the target. This beam of light that transmitted for just 2 seconds brought them the news of success. Half a minute later, Tang Weiji received a call from the ground command center. Only one sentence was sent through his phone. Congratulations to you, congratulations to us. This is a monumental moment. Zhang Chen sent his blessing to the governor of the lunar colony. Filled with excitement, he put down the phone, patted Kelvin's shoulder, and walked out of the command room. Passing through the corridor, through the front hall, and standing on the lawn outside the ground command center, he could still hear the cheers. Although he did not see it, he could imagine people embracing each other, high-fiving each other, and celebrating the accomplishment with each other. Then the tensed state began to dissipate. He first smiled and soon began to laugh. It was finally successful. The last 2 months of hard work has not been in vain. It won't take long for the high-voltage electricity shot from the moon to connect the grid across the 2 oceans. After seeing the ultra-low cost of lunar power generation, more and more small and medium-sized countries will abandon nuclear power and thermal power, join in his global power grid plan, and be bundled with the submarine transmission cable forever. At this moment, Zai Asha walked next to him, poked his waist, and interrupted his fantasy. "Is this it?" With a surreal tone, Xiaoshu whispered. Zhang Chen turned and gave Xiaoshu a big hug. Before her exclaim, he kissed her on the lips and looked at her pretty face. He joked with a grin. "What else? Put a rainbow aurora in the sky?" A light wave shorter than the ultraviolet wavelength cannot be observed with the naked eye. Even on the space elevator, it would be impossible to see the laser that is coming from the moon. Xiaoshu blushed, and anxiously looked around. After confirming that there was no one else, she relaxed her tense body and poked the tip of Zhang Chen's nose. "You are such a child." Aisha came over and enviously looked at Xiaoshu, who was picked up by Zhang Chen, and gently pulled on Zhang Chen's shirt. "What's wrong?" Zhang Chen turned his head and smiled at her. Aisha did not speak, but the watery sapphire-like pupils spoke for her. "I also want a hug." As Zhang Chen was enjoying the company of the two beauties, the ground command center was also filled with excitement and joy. After the excitement, Kelvin looked at the three-dimensional image on the holographic screen, and cast a look full of fascination. The three satellites floating in the geosynchronous orbit formed an isosceles triangle, like a piece of art that combined the beauty of mathematics and physics. The three uniquely shaped satellites formed the prisms that remain relatively static on all three sides to either pass the laser beam or reflect the laser beam on the receiving ring on the outer side of the space elevator. There, light energy was converted into electrical energy, along the superconductor transmission lines installed outside the space elevator. Then the energy was transferred from the geosynchronous orbit to the ground, or up to Celestial City. If the space elevator only allowed the world to see the broad opportunities for the starry sky and ignite people's enthusiasm for investing in the aerospace industry, then this laser from the moon made everyone see the real benefits. Without any other products and just selling electricity, it could easily allow the lunar colony that burned hundreds of millions every month to achieve profitability. Chapter 977 Run after you showed off. In front of the pure white presidential palace of Koro City was a beautifully constructed lawn. On this lawn, the people of Xin gathered. They looked excited and focused on the stage. In a round of applause, their beloved President Zhang Yaping stepped onto the stage, smiled, and waved his hand. He then cleared his throat and fixed the microphone. "Today is a great day. This morning, from 8 o'clock a.m. to 5 p.m., our compatriots on the lunar colony have sent us 20 million kWh of electricity. Maybe you are surprised, but I am now honored to announce this fact to you. The breakthrough we have made in long-distance power transmission technology has enabled our grid to be connected to the power grid of the lunar colony." The long-suppressed cheers erupted, and countless people shook the Xin flag in their hands and celebrated this great moment. Sitting on a special guest's seat, Zhang Chen, who was looking at Zhang Yaping speaking in front of the stage, nodded and clapped. After the whole audience quieted down, Zhang Yaping looked at the people with a smile, raised his hands, and loudly stated, "All this time we had to pay for expensive electricity prices because of energy dependence, because of the high cost of nuclear power, and because of other reasons. We had to sacrifice the environment, sacrifice safety, and sacrifice our children and grandchildren's future. But now, I solemnly announce to all of you that all that has become history." The environmentalists in the audience looked at their president with excitement. Most of them were wearing green headscarves and green shirts, easily distinguishable from the crowd. Since the construction of the thermal power station and the nuclear power plant in Xin, they have raised their voices of opposition. But now, all this has finally been rewarded. Although it had nothing to do with their protests, from today, I announce, Xin will systemically remove thermal power and nuclear power. Let this picturesque archipelago stay forever. In addition, I am here to make a commitment. The basic electricity price of our country will be cut by 10 times in 1 month. IEEI. The cheers in the audience roared and Zhang Chen smiled at the excited crowd. Starting today, Xin will open a new chapter and usher in a new era of electrification. Throughout the history of the world, the capital always played a pivotal role in the promotion of social progress. When the cost of electricity is infinitely compressed, energy-efficient electric equipment will naturally spread to every corner of society. Because of this light from the moon, Zin has already boarded the train to high-speed development. From pure electric vehicles to digital cities, the door to the future has now opened. Now, please allow me to hand over the rest of this time to Mr. Zhang Chen, the president of Future Group. In a round of applause, Zhang Yaping smiled warmly and welcomed Zhang Chen, who slowly walked onto the stage, as he then retreated to the side. After the thunderous applause quieted down a little, Zhang Chen cleared his throat and reached out to grab the microphone. Hello, everyone, I am Zhang Chen. I am honored to stand here and say hello to all of you. As a responsible company, we will actively respond to the policies of the Zin government. Here, I declare that starting today, Zin will shut down the first and last nuclear power plant on Koro Island. The environmentalists broke out with cheers, and Zhang Chen nodded to the people with the green headscarves. Most of the facilities used in the nuclear power plant for nuclear reaction will be dismantled, leaving only one reactor for the production of deuterium. The original site of the nuclear power plant will be converted into a safe, harmless deuterium refinery by using separation from seawater. Someone may ask, what is the deuterium used for? Is it used for nuclear weapons? Before answering this question, I want to ask you to think about a problem first. From today, we will enjoy the electricity from the moon. But how is the lunar colony generating electricity? Solar? Many scholars and experts in the world guessed this. But what I am saying here is that this is a misunderstanding. Looking at the crowd, Zhang Chen paused and raised his volume. In order to understand the possible misunderstandings, here I decided to open a document that belongs to the A-Class Confidential of Future Group. Zhang Chen noticed that when he mentioned the word confidential, the audience was silent, and everyone was waiting for him to continue, especially the journalists, as they already smelled groundbreaking news, and they want to capture every muscle on Zhang Chen's face. Under everyone's gaze, Zhang Chen slowly said, not just wireless power transmission. Our biggest breakthrough is controllable nuclear fusion. As early as 2 months ago, the world's first nuclear fusion generator using helium-3 and deuterium as fuel was built in the lunar colony. This sentence, like a deep-water bomb, was directly thrown into the crowd, including journalists, Zin citizens, and tourists. Everyone blanked out for 2 seconds. Through this gap, Zhang Chen wisely gave the position on the stage to Zhang Yaping, and hurriedly stepped down before the media came up. Listening to the exclamations and shouts from behind him, a smile emerged on his face. The feeling of showing off and running was certainly exciting. Zhang Chen didn't know how Zhang Yaping settled the chaos and appeased the reporters who rushed up onto the stage. After his speech, he went straight to the office at the presidential palace. About half an hour later, Zhang Yaping, who announced the end of the speech, returned to the presidential palace and went straight back to his office. After seeing Zhang Chen sitting in his office, he told the assistant to make 2 cups of black tea and then sat on the sofa opposite Zhang Chen. A very good speech. You have stolen my thunder. Have I? Then I have to give my assistant who helped me write the speech a raise. The two looked at each other and laughed at the same time. Zhang Chen tried the still hot black tea and mentioned something else. It seems that you are confident with your campaign. Of course. Zhang Yaping laughed and squinted his eyebrows at Zhang Chen's humorously. The poll shows that our support rate is over 80%. Far higher than the second Whig Party and the third Socialist Party. As long as this trend continues, I will still be sitting in this position for the next 4 years. Zhang Yaping cleverly used the phrase our support rate. However, Zhang Chen just smiled. He gently stirred the black tea with a spoon and whispered, "This trend will continue." It is said that the Whig Party is supported by the British government. They advocate promoting Zin to join the Commonwealth. The Socialist Party is supported by the people on the other side of the Pacific. They advocate the restoration of governing Banu Islands as in the 1970s and abolish defense contracting. They won't cause a stir. Zhang Chen smiled and said casually, "The ghost is staring at them." A smile formed on Zhang Yaping's face. Compared to the young man who found Zhang Chen because of his ideals 4 years ago, he has now become a sleek and shrewd politician. He was very clear that as long as he holds the golden thigh of Future Group, His presidential status will be unshakable. Jiang Chen, who needed a stable political environment, would never easily replace his long-term cooperation. Chapter 978 Controversies. Just after Jiang Chen disclosed that Future Group has mastered controllable nuclear fusion technology, the internet was taken by storm. This news was published onto an official source on Weibo, and the comments section exploded. Nuclear fusion? How is this possible? Do you know the central temperature of the nuclear fusion reaction? If you don't know, I will tell you. More than 20 million degrees Celsius. There is no material in the world that can withstand this temperature. I don't know if the material exists in the solar system, but at least not on Earth. I don't know much, but I have some common sense. Since the temperature is too high, can't you turn down the fire? I think that our country's researchers can start from this angle. Since Xin can come up with a solution, it shouldn't be too difficult. Do you think the reactor is your gas stove? Ha ha ha. In addition to these non-constructive replies, many well-known influencers also left their opinions, and expressed their views on the breakthrough of the two major technical problems: long wireless power transmission and controllable nuclear fusion. I hope that another 10,000 SCI papers can be exchanged for controllable nuclear fusion. When we are still studying how to carve on bronze, the compatriots across the ocean have already picked up the hammer and started to wrought iron. I mean nothing more than just my amazement of the change happening in our generation. A well-known news commentator shared his amazement after reading the report. Because of the breakthrough in nuclear fusion technology, the Xin electricity price has dropped from 0.22x ND to 0.12x ND. I don't know why the official source didn't report this. I saw it in the international news of Future 1.0. It seems that the title of the Country of Hope can be moved across the Pacific Ocean. Xin's housing price is not very expensive. Celestial Trade also recently announced the Mars colonization plan. People who can't afford housing can consider this since there is no need to learn foreign languages there. Haha. A streamer named Shadow Devil on Godly Land bragged on his streaming channel. Not only who was shocked by the technological progress of Future Group, but the you across the ocean was also shocked. In the evening scientific talk show aired by CBS, nuclear physics expert, Professor Omar Harrican of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory made a rare appearance. Using easy-to-understand language, he explained the difficulty of controllable nuclear fusion. As early as the 1950s, we made bold predictions that after 30 years, we can use nuclear fusion to generate electricity. But knowing that today, the word 30 years later is still an optimistic estimate. As many people know, there is no material in the world that can withstand the high temperature of 20 million degrees. Even if there is, we have absolutely no way to use it. In the interview, Professor Harrican explained, just a few years ago, we were infinitely close to controllable nuclear fusion technology. At our Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, in the inertial confinement fusion, 192 lasers were used to heat and compress a fuel pellet until the nuclear fusion reaction took place, and the prototype of a small nuclear fusion power generation device is already in place. The device is now in Livermore, California. It's like a metal-wrapped ball, but the reactants are smaller than a fingernail. Having said that, Professor Omar Harrican's expression became quite melancholic. They originally thought that in nuclear fusion technology, the only ones that matched them was Russia, and while Hua was catching up, they did not expect another private enterprise would suddenly emerge. The host Anderson nodded seriously and then asked, "So, how far do you think the US from mastering controllable nuclear fusion technology? It may be tomorrow, or it may be 30 years later." Professor Harrican shook his head with a smile. For science, unless you have crossed that door, you never know how many steps are left. When the public talked about the establishment of a Celestial Trade nuclear fusion power station trade, the top officials of various governments did not stop their actions. The IA took the lead in raising the budget of 3 nuclear research institutes in the country and announced that its domestic research institutes have already made major breakthroughs in nuclear fusion projects. At the same time, Gary, who was visiting Europe, negotiated with France to establish a submarine transmission cable from the west coast to Paris. On the other hand, the capital had not forgotten to launch a diplomatic attack, obstructing the agreement on the construction of submarine cables Celestial Trade had signed with Australia and Nippon. Obviously, the Hill government has already noticed that the submarine cable laid by Celestial Trade would have an incalculable impact on the diplomatic strategy. Regardless of whether there is progress on controllably nuclear fusion, is there any ability to extract helium-3 only available on the Moon? The Hill government, which could no longer sit around, had begun to establish submarine cables connecting the and European power grids. The Russian side had been unable to increase its budget for nuclear fusion projects because of the deteriorating economy in the country. Moreover, considering that even if they developed their own controllable nuclear fusion technology, they did not have the ability to build a colony on the Moon to refine helium-3, they would ultimately have to purchase from Celestial Trade. Russia simply sent a high-level diplomat to Zin along with the president of its own state power company. They discussed with Celestial Trade about the construction of a submarine cable from Ainge to Vladivostok. Since this submarine cable was in the same direction as the submarine cable leading to Nippon, construction could be started simultaneously. This time, Zhang Chen did not go personally, but the other party came to the table. The advantage was on Zhang Chen's side. After some discussion, Russia accepted 70% of the construction and maintenance costs of submarine cables, and Celestial Trade would also hire Russian-based companies to complete the construction of this submarine transmission cable. As for Hua, the country's attitude toward Celestial Trade making breakthroughs in nuclear fusion technology was somewhat ambiguous. As a world factory, Hua's annual power generation was also the first in the world. The magnificent Three Gorges project was a miracle of hydropower projects in the history of mankind. Its power generation was equivalent to 5 Diabay nuclear power plants, but the cost was far lower than the expensive nuclear power. The industrial and civil electricity prices in Hua were at a relatively low price. This was why Zhang Chen did not list Hua as one of the first targets in establishing the global power grid plan, because to the rich nation, his cheap electricity was not so attractive. Moreover, it was difficult for domestic enterprises to compete fairly with the colossal state grid, let alone foreign companies. Technology, financial subsidies can achieve the same result. Is there a need? Of course, there is a need, but it is not urgent. Adhering to the tradition of making a fortune but keeping quiet, they were not vocal with their strategy of whether or not to increase the budget for the research of controllable nuclear fusion, or the establishment of a new space strategy. Chapter 979 Uncertain Times. Just like Zhang Chen expected, the Yi family and the Liu family came to see him about the difficulty of establishing a nuclear fusion power station. After hearing the need to use helium-3 on the Moon as a nuclear material, they stopped the conversation, and instead asked if Future Group had any research on controllable fusion. If helium-3 and deuterium fusion were second-generation nuclear fusion power generation technologies, then deuterium-tritium was first-generation technology. Although the nuclear waste produced was difficult to manage, the advantage was that all the raw materials could be obtained from the ocean without relying on importing from Celestial Trade. The two countries were related by blood, but they were not without reservations. Hua would not allow the necessary energy in the country to rely on foreign imports, especially if it were monopolized by one party unless there was no better choice. Zhang Chen also wouldn't sell the information on the first-generation nuclear fusion technology as that was his cash cow. So, he euphemistically told Liu Xianggo that Future Group had no research on the controllable fusion between deuterium and tritium. Regardless if Liu Xianggo believes it or not, there was nothing he could do even if he doesn't believe it. Just as Future Group made a splash in the community arena because of long-distance wireless transmission and controllable nuclear fusion, when countries re-examined the bilateral relationship with Sin, another big news captured the headlines. At 9 p.m. Paris time on April 7, 2019, EU Foreign Minister suddenly announced that EU will no longer be a collective but will be a united and become a powerful single entity. or a country. On the sandy beaches north of Coral Island, a private island surrounded by beaches and palm trees was situated there. An elegant and chic wooden mansion was located in the middle of the island. Under the rising sun in the horizon, everything looked like it was gilded by a layer of gold. Occasionally, Jiang Chen chose to come here for a holiday or to relax. On the morning of April 1st, after the long-distance power transmission startup ceremony and the afternoon speech, he flew here by helicopter with Aisha and Xiaoshu. Now, it was the third day of their holiday. If nothing else, the entire Coral Island should now be filled with high-level officials, countless foreign journalists, and experts and scholars in the scientific community from all over the world. These people all wanted to see him, but Jiang Chen obviously wouldn't be making their wish come true. The best way to deal with the problem was to give yourself a vacation, wait for the international community to lose interest, and then make further plans. But what Jiang Chen didn't think was that it all came so fast. In the living room of the mansion, watching the EU foreign minister speaking on TV, Jiang Chen was pondering. Originally, Natasha also planned to come here for a vacation, but because of this event, she had to fly back to Moscow overnight. Jiang Chen closed his eyes and carefully recalled. When she left, her expression seemed stern, and she seems to have said, "Since the Cold War, the entire Eastern Europe has not been so close to the edge of war." Why? It was only a decision within the EU. Was this necessarily related to war? Jiang Chen closed his eyes and pondered for a long time. With only limited intelligence, he could not analyze the situation. Ghost agents had been working with KGB for a long time in Frankfurt, but there was no good news, which also made him feel a bit anxious. The situation seemed to be moving in an unexpected direction, but he couldn't get a reference from the future because the two worlds were not on the same line. Just then, Aisha in a swimsuit brought milk and freshly baked bakeries to Jiang Chen. Sitting timidly next to Jiang Chen, Aisha kissed him on the cheek and spoke softly. "Eat something first." With his brows no longer furrowed, Jiang Chen smiled and kissed her on the cheek. Public display of affection in the morning? Xiaoshu, wearing pajamas, walked out of the bedroom and brushed her hair back. She looked at the Aisha sticking next to Jiang Chen in only a swimsuit and pouted in jealousy. Of course, she was not really jealous. After half year of coexisting, she seemed to be accustomed to the three-person life. This aspect was due to Aisha's view and character, and the two live harmoniously. On the other hand, it was purely because of Jiang Chen's desire which made it harder and harder to meet his demand. "Do you want one too?" Jiang Chen, with a smug smile, moved his face closer. "Screw you." Xiaoshu got closer to Jiang Chen's face and viciously bit his ear. After listening to the painful cry that he faked, she turned around to the washroom with satisfaction. After breakfast together, the three went to the beach, set up a parasol, moved over a cold drink cart and beach chairs, and spread a beach mat on the sand. The morning sun was not hot, with a salty sea breeze. There was even a cool hint of air. Lying on the beach mat, Xiaoshu accepted Jiang Chen's caressing hand against her body as she applied sunscreen for him. Then she lied face down on the beach mat and lazily basked in the sun while leisurely watching Aisha and Jiang Chen run to the sea. "I have been too lazy recently," Xiaoshu whispered. Her fingers slid gently down on her wrist and a light blue light prism spread out. The boot screen of Future Phone appeared. Although she was on vacation, she was the CEO of Future Group, and she habitually checked her work emails every morning and evening. When she opened Gene Office, Xiaoshu got closer to her straw and took a sip as she looked at the work email and picked up the emails that needed to be replied to. The lunar colony has discovered rare earth deposits, and the reserves of rare earth elements such as lanthanum and cerium are about 3 million tons or more. Seeing this, Xiaoshu was astonished. Because the subsidiaries of Future Group were involved in the mining industry, she still knew about the market of rare earths. As a rare earth exporting country, whose rare earth reserves accounts for 36% of the world's proven reserves, which was 36 million tons. What is the concept of 3 million tons? India's rare earth reserves were 3.1 million tons, ranking 5th in the world. The mineral deposits found in the lunar colony were almost compared the rare earth reserves throughout India. No wonder they said the moon is a giant lump of gold. This is not even gold. This is worth more than gold. Zayasha moved her lips and thought for a while, and gave instructions in the email, annotating this message as B-class confidential, and entered it into Future Group state base. Now, because of nuclear fusion power generation, there were already too many eyes focusing on Future Group and Celestial. At this time, the lunar colony's discovery of a rare earth deposit would only draw some people to take action, slow down the pace of announcements, and release it once mining starts. Just as Zayasha tossed the message aside and looked down the list, an email suddenly caught her attention. Chapter 980 UFO. On the 4th day of his vacation, Zhang Chen ended the scheduled 7-day holiday ahead of time and boarded a helicopter back to Koro Island. Everything was because of an email that temporarily changed his vacation schedule. The evening of April 4th, a black helicopter's propellers roared, approaching a small island on the equator that was heavily guarded. It descended on the tarmac with flashing green lights. The helicopter did not come to a full stop yet, but Zhang Chen, who was in casual outfit, jumped on the tarmac and walked to Kelvin. He had been waiting here for a long time. This is the original site of the Space Launch Center. After the establishment of the Space Department, it was renamed the Celestial Trade Ground Command Center. It is the headquarters of the most extensive Space Department. Walking side by side on the way to the command center, Kelvin said with a serious look, "The night before, the astronomical observation team of our Mars colonization project made an optical observation of the C1201 channel during the astronomical data analysis of the Mars route, and then discovered the thing. It is unbelievable. Is the information controlled?" Zhang Chen asked without stopping. "Everything has been controlled," Kelvin said solemnly. Zhang Chen nodded. "The confidentiality level is listed as S-class, and the relevant personnel have to be temporarily isolated." Kelvin took a deep breath and nodded. "I understand." The Mars Colonization Project team, established for the purpose of Mars colonization, was designed to address all the difficulties that may arise from the colonial ship's departure to the colonizers' life after landing on Mars. The ecosystem could be built by the Garden of Eden project from the Apocalypse. But other troubles were not small. Even if it absorbed the technology from the Apocalypse, many places must be personally involved in the design by modern world's researchers. In the timeline of the Apocalypse, for various political and diplomatic reasons, until the war, no one from the three ideologies successfully built a colonization ship to Mars or achieved a breakthrough in scaling space activities. According to Lin Lin, there were indeed colonies of CCCP, NATO, and PAC on Mars, but they were basically scientific in nature, and the scale was naturally quite limited. After they could not achieve a ecological cycle, after the space elevator was destroyed, 3 colonies that depended on the supply from Earth were forced to be abandoned. It is not difficult to launch a spacecraft onto Mars. NASA did it a long time ago. But to build a colony that maintained a stable exchange of goods with the Earth, rather than letting Mars become a one-way ticket, was not just as simple as launching a spacecraft. Mars and the Earth have always maintained relative movements, with distances ranging from 5,500 to 40,000 million kilometers. Ensuring a stable route from Earth to Mars was the key to achieving the Mars colonization project. This work was done by the Astronomical Observation Team. Their daily work revolved around confirming the navigation channel calculated by the quantum computer, using optical, spectral and other observation means to examine if there were obstacles such as meteorites and asteroids on the path. However, when observing the channel number C1201, they found something similar to a UFO. The two stopped in front of an aluminum alloy door with the Mars Colonization Project logo. Kevlin pulled out the graphene card and swiped it on the card reader at the door. When the door opened, Kelvin quickly walked to the holographic screen in front of him. and the project leader immediately gave up his spot. Kelvin reached out and clicked on the operation interface, then he patted the chair of the front row staff and ordered, "Align the Celestial Trade number 1 telescope to the number C1201 channel, Roger." The staff member nodded and typed on the touchscreen. The astronomical telescope on the faraway celestial city slightly tilted, and the lens began to zoom. Soon Zhang Chen saw that there was a dark shadow in the center of the holographic screen. The shape of the shadow was similar to the regular sphere, and the surrounding space was distorted by waves similar to wrinkles, exuding an ominous feeling. His pupils contracted, and Zhang Chen instantly tensed up. By spectral analysis of the elements, the target titanium content is above 61%. Kelvin did not notice the change in Zhang Chen's expression. He called out another orange-red spectrum diagram and explained the parameters to Zhang Chen. When he heard this sentence, he slowly relaxed his tightened fists. Although he was uncertain whether the unknown civilization used metal to arm itself, at least one thing was certain: since the technology of harmony shifted to organism, the carbon content must be more than 50%. Slightly settling his emotions, Zhang Chen raised his chin and focused on the black sphere in the holographic screen. "What is that?" "We don't know." Kelvin's expression was extremely odd. It contained excitement and doubt. "We guess it might be a UFO. From another civilization." "Another civilization?" Zhang Chen processed the information and frowned. "Zoom in on it." "Can't do it." Kelvin shook his head. "Can't do it?" Kelvin did not explain but chose to show why. He patted the chair of the staff member sitting in front of him, and gestured to adjust the focal length of the telescope to focus on the UFO. What happened next made Zhang Chen widen his eyes. As the lens zoomed in, the image of the UFO in the center began to tear. When the distance reached a certain limit, the dark UFO started to blur, and finally disappeared from the picture. Yes, it disappeared. Silence lasted for a while, and when the staff zoomed out, Zhang Chen spoke abruptly. "Optical invisibility." "Yes," Kelvin said, nodding. "We think so too." From this point alone, it completely ruled out the possibility that the spacecraft was launched by the former Soviet Union or the At present, only Celestial Trade and Future Group have mastered the mature optical invisibility technology. This UFO can be optically observed. Our technology temporarily is unable to analyze what mechanism is behind it. But one thing is certain: this function should be damaged for some reason. Otherwise we should not see it at all. We definitely shouldn't be able to see a black shadow at a certain distance, as it is now. Kelvin paused for a moment and explained his own speculation. If this interpretation is true, then the only possibility is that this should be the wreckage of a UFO. Looking at the black shadow on the screen, Zhang Chen meditated for a long time, then spoke. "Is there any way to retrieve it?" Kelvin shook his head as an ugly expression appeared on his face. "It's too far away. It's 30 million kilometers away from us based on a straight line trajectory. Our Stingray X-1 series spacecraft has a cruising radius of only 1 million kilometers. It is simply not suitable for flight outside the Earth-Moon system, let alone have it retrieve something. Just go up and have a look." Zhang Chen looked at Kelvin. "We at least have to know what it is. At least we must know before other countries know what it is." After debating for a long time, Kelvin sighed. "In theory, the RM-400 ion propulsion engine used by the Stingray X-1 series spacecraft already has the capability of interplanetary navigation. With the ejection port of the space elevator, it is not difficult to accelerate to the second cosmic speed and get out of the Earth-Moon system. But the key is the battery of the Stingray X-1. According to the calculation of the quantum computer, its energy is just enough for one round trip. Forcibly carrying out this mission will have a high probability of being a one-way trip. Once it is impossible to return, it'll float forever in the universe and be equivalent to a death certificate. After thinking for a moment, Zhang Chen made a decision. Select volunteers from active pilots in Celestial Trade. The rank of the individuals who participate in this top-secret mission will automatically rise by 3 levels, whether the individual returns alive or not. Install hibernation chambers in the Stingray X-1. If it is determined that it is impossible to return, Allow the hibernation procedure to start and send our volunteers to the future. Chapter 981 Enterprise Dictatorship. The problem of the spacecraft was easy to resolve. In addition to the 4 Stingray P-1s already being delivered to Future Mining, the Stingray X-1 prototypes built by Future Heavy Industries and Celestial Duty X-1 prototypes entered the delivery phase. By selecting a Stingray X-1 and adding a NetAC module, it could be upgraded to a Stingray A-1 with outer space combat capabilities. At present, Celestial Trade trained a total of 20 Stingray series spacecraft pilots, all of whom received training for the 3 models. The problem now was choosing one volunteer from the 20 people. As Kelvin said, there was a high probability that this would be a death flight without a return trip. If the remaining energy at the time of return wasn't enough to accelerate the spacecraft to a position close to the Earth-Moon system, it might be difficult to retrieve the spacecraft with existing technology. Although it was important to determine what the UFO was, it was impossible for Zhang Chen to spend all of his time in boundless space. The volunteer selection and psychological work were handed over to Kelvin. After receiving the guarantee of completion of the task, Zhang Chen shifted the focus of his work to the European issue. As of mid-February, 317 high-ranking European officials have died in various accidents. All the clues pointed to one source. They were all opponents of EU integration. Here, Monica Gale stood before Zhang Chen's desk, her head bowed down. "I'm very sorry, we have been misled." Before the EU integration resolution vote, we thought this was the Rothschild Consortium's plan to implement the Southern Corridor. Please raise your head, don't blame yourself too much. You are not to blame. After all of our energy has been focused on Russia's plan. After all, Europeans' ghost agents' full cooperation with the KGB to assist the coup in Frankfurt was his personal order. Watching Monica raise her head high, Zhang Chen tapped his finger then said, "The situation in Europe is now out of our control, but it's not to an irreparable point. You will return to Europe tomorrow. I need you to do something." Monica nodded, her expression solemn. "It will be my duty." The commercial bank headquarters, the headquarters of the Frankfurt Commercial Bank, was the tallest skyscraper in the country. It had been the tallest building since it was completed in 1997 and was the tallest building in Europe until 2003. As one of the 3 largest banks in the country, few people know that the name Rothschild was at the top of its list of shareholders. At 8 p.m. Berlin time, the building was decorated with lights. In the empty top-floor conference room, Carmen Rothschild stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, holding the red wine produced by his own winery, quietly watching the bustling night. Just then, a slightly short and obsessive Germanic man opened the door and walked in. "Wait for me outside." The bodyguard behind the Germanic man nodded, stepping back halfway and standing at the door. The door was closed. The Caucasian bodyguard with sunglasses and a black suit turned sideways slightly and looked at the black man standing on the other side of the door. "Hello." Johnson said hello to him in French as he smiled. The white bodyguard didn't respond to him. He looked straight ahead and stood still. Johnson licked the corners of his mouth and didn't pay more attention to him. He continued to stand guard, but the expression between his eyebrows gradually returned to the previous coldness. Carmen turned around, smiled, opened his arms and greeted the Germanic man. "Welcome, Glenn Krupp, my old friend. We meet again." "Yes, we meet again." Glenn Krupp forced a smile and hugged Carmen, hiding the dissatisfaction in his mind. Then he put his coat on the chair. "Can you explain something to your old friend? What do you or the Rothschild family want to do?" Unlike the Jewish family that emerged from the United Kingdom, the Krupp family, born in the traditional Prussian aristocracy, was tied to the German chariot along with the invincible artillery. The family, with their influence in arms, steel, ships, textiles, chemicals, oil refining, electromechanics, and even elevators in buildings, was almost integrated into every corner of Europe. They might not be as rich as the Rothschild family, but they weren't inferior to the Jewish family. Carmen saw through the concern on Glenn's face. He coughed and placed the red wine on the conference table. "If a company controls the food, medical care, water supply, power supply, light and heavy industries, national defense, and even the military in a region. What's the difference between this enterprise and the country in the region? Or what's the difference between the existence of this country? You know very well, I just did the right thing, Glenn Krupp sneered. We're most worried about this point. Whenever our old friends think they're right, all of us might be in trouble. The pasts of the Rothschild family and the Krupp family shared a very similar point. That is, they used to support a certain demon, and they were almost sent to hell by that very demon. The Rothschilds once lost all of Europe, and the Prussian aristocracy suffered in the hands of the National Guards. In history, every madman trying to unify Europe had brought disaster to the whole world. Through bloody means, the Rothschild family forced the adoption of the EU Integration Act at the EU meeting in an attempt to turn the entire EU into a country, then chose a puppet while controlling them behind the scenes. Not only the Krupp family, but all the Level 33 members of the Freemasonry felt a little uneasy about the Rothschilds' behavior. My dear friend, please listen to me first, Carmen said as he smiled. I will give you half an hour, Glenn Krupp said coldly as he looked down at the watch. Carmen shrugged, looking nonchalant. After clearing his throat, he paused for a while, then began to speak. People are economic animals. People can't live without money. And our society is the same. The speed of social development depends on the flow of money. If society is compared to human beings, then money is its blood. Throughout the history of the world, countless revolutions were just mere attempts to overthrow those blood clouts in the blood vessels of civilization. We chose a puppet, and we stood behind the scenes, manipulating this puppet. We will be more democratic than ever, more advanced than ever. We no longer manipulate the elections. We directly manipulate the candidates, and at the same time, our president no longer enjoys the power that the president deserves. This new regime, I call it enterprise dictatorship. Why do I feel this was copied from somewhere? Glenn sneered. I have to admit that our opponents inspired me, Carmen said with a smile. Although we also manipulate politics, they're more absolute than us. But I am discussing us, not them. Carmen pointed to his own chest and pointed to the ring on his hand that symbolized the Level 33 member. Then he said, dysfunctional subsidiaries will be reorganized, turning losses into profits and revitalizing in the restructuring process. The EU is the same, and the restructured EU will be more efficient and stronger than ever. And you, me, and the newly established 13-member committee will serve as the shareholders of the entire EU. Chapter 982 I curse you. Silence ensued for a long time in the conference room. Glenn Krupp now knew that the Rothschild family had been planning this for a long time. At that time, he only thought that shift to the right in politics was just because of a feudal grudge between the Jews and the Middle Easterners, but he didn't expect that all of this was foreshadowing today. Glenn spoke slowly. Then Frankfurt will become the state of Frankfurt? Yes. Rothschild smiled. What about France? The state of France. Ha ha. What about Poland? Naturally the state of Poland. Ha 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 ha. Glenn raised his head and began to laugh hysterically as if he heard a great joke. He took 2 steps back and suddenly spat next to his shoes. Hitler should have killed you idiots. I've never prayed for him to climb out of his grave like this. After he cursed out, Glenn pulled his coat and walked to the door without turning his head. He opened the door, but he froze. Blood slowly flowed down, soaking his soles and freezing his line of sight. Outside of the conference room, a man in disbelief had his throat slit by a dagger. Your bodyguard is strong, but that's it. Johnson grinned and leaned against the door, wiping the blood on the dagger with his hand. How could it be? Glenn squeezed a few words out of his throat and turned stiffly, but his eyes met a black muzzle. Boom! There was a spark, a gunshot, and Glenn collapsed to the ground. Smoke emitted from the revolver, and Rothschild looked straight at the expression still filled with disbelief with a sly smile. For the glory of the Freemasonry, please go to hell. Blood coughed out of Glenn's mouth. He used his blood-filled pupils to stare at his former friend. The Krupp family will not spare you. You won't succeed. Is that the case? Carmen kneeled down and looked down at Glenn's face. Unfortunately, as soon as you entered this building, Your younger brother became the new chairman of the Krupp Group. Carmen paused for 2 seconds and added a sentence, with the help of Rothschild Bank. Glenn's eyes widened, and fury was blazing in his pupils. It was directed at the betrayal of his family or the hatred of the name Rothschild. The muzzle gently stroked his chin, and Carmen stared into his eyes and suddenly sighed. My friend, I gave you a chance. You don't have to be like this. If we had just reached an agreement, today would have had another ending. I curse you. Glenn interrupted Carmen, and the blood was gushing out of his mouth, dyeing his white teeth blood red. I curse your family and you will go to hell, tortured by Satan. Carmen slightly nodded. My friend, you don't have to say all this. We will meet again in hell, but you will go first. Carmen gently placed the pistol on his chest, reached out and slowly closed his widened eyes. Then he removed the blood-stained ring from Glenn's stiff finger. And how can Satan punish his believers? Retrieving the ring symbolizing the level 33 membership, Carmen laughed in self-mockery, then stood up. Back to his former friend, he looked at Johnson. Clean this place up. Even if he is abandoned, he's the former head of the Krupp family and deserves the respect of allies. Yes, Johnson nodded. In eastern Kane, in the northwestern suburb of Esk, the city ruins turned into front lines littered with trenches and bunkers. Fortunately, some Russian warfield engineers helped the civilian armed forces to fortify their defenses to prevent the war from being so one-sided. With the support of EMP weapons from the Russian-Uzbek border, the civilian armed forces successfully pushed the front line to the east bank of the Dnieper River, but now the situation suddenly turned south. 10 kilometers away from the front line, Natasha, wrapped in a heavy coat, saw the informant, the Ukrainian government officer, Skanov. She handed a document from Moscow and a box of crumpled cigars. Skanov grinned, and the wrinkles at the corner of his eyes cracked like a spider web. He took a cigar from the cigar box and put the document in front of his chest. Say hello to your father for me and say that the old guy thanks him for his gift. Natasha spit out a cloud of white mist, and she glanced through the shadows between the ruins. Somewhat absent-mindedly, she said, I will. For 3 years, even if she returned to Kane occasionally, she only operated in the relatively safe Crimea area. It was her first time in 3 years being so close to the front line. The environmental changes made the place somewhat unrecognizable, and the cold climate made her feel even stranger. Even she was surprised that she became used to the small island of the Western Pacific, and the man who was sometimes shrewd and sometimes naive. If it weren't for the drastic changes a few days ago, she would still be on vacation on a private island. Skanov grinned and teased, thinking about a man. Natasha glanced at him coldly. What's the situation on the front line? Extinguishing the cigar with his thumb, Skanov stuffed the half-smoked cigar back into his dirty pocket. The Future Group once destroyed the Freemasonry Arrow in Madagascar. We once thought they destroyed it, but in fact, the Freemasonry only moved it from South Africa to North Africa. Now, it is in Europe. It is across our or your side. NATO promised not to send troops to Ukraine, so mercenaries who weren't bound by laws and international conventions stood across them, and most of these mercenaries came from refugee camps on the borders of Sweden, Norway and Finland. No one expected that the refugee camps, which were jointly funded by major European consortiums and built after the Frankfurt tragedy, became the source of mercenaries of the European consortiums. In order to get their families away from the cruel and cold refugee camps, they fought tenaciously on the battlefield. Natasha looked more serious. You are so smart, you should have guessed it, said Skanov. The integration of the EU, the new puppet taking office, and the fact that many of the original ridiculous things have become natural. I don't think that's how the EU managed to unify. Natasha shook her head. What's not possible? Skanov shook his head and said indifferently, although I thought they were joking until a week ago. Standing in front of the civilian armed forces is no longer a weak and incompetent Ukrainian army, but a well-trained, well-equipped private arm. They bought the Faraday spray from the other side of the Atlantic in the name of counter-terrorism and applied it to the tank armor on a large scale. which effectively counters the EMP weapon in our hands. We can only hope for those brave and fearless citizens after losing this one card. Faraday spray was a tactical anti-EMP weapon developed by the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense. By spraying droplets of a specific content and diameter, it formed a simple Faraday cage within the white mist envelope so that the electrons wrapped in were protected from EMP weapons. The technical content of this weapon wasn't high, but it was surprisingly effective when defending against electromagnetic pulses. It was tested in the Second Demilal Island War. Is there no way to sanction them? Natasha said with a frown. Although Russia also secretly sent its own soldiers dressed as civilians to support the civilian armed forces, this practice was ultimately not allowed. Most of the soldiers who participated in the war were instructors and military advisors and rarely participated on the actual battlefield. After all, if Russians died there, it wouldn't be easy to explain. Sganov shook his head. International law can't sanction them because they don't belong to any country in principle but are employed by the Ukrainian government. Having said that, Sganov paused for a moment thoughtfully. Unless we hire another mercenary force and fight with them. Chapter 983. A ship. Putting on the helmet and carefully checking each seat belt, Liu Qingpeng opened the instrument in the cockpit. After taking a few deep breaths and trying to make his expression look less stiff, he touched the side of the helmet and a light blue prism spread out in front of his eyes. An unfamiliar but ordinary female face emerged in front of his eyes. Number 01 Navigator is at your service. Are you nervous? Liu Qingpeng forced a smile. What do you think? You'd better control your heart rate, which will help avoid accidents. In order to save onboard fuel as much as possible, you will complete the acceleration step on the runway. How much G-force? 20.1. Can you apply for a Guinness World Record for me? Liu Qingpeng forced a smile, but only bitterness was visible on his face. The navigator said with no sense of humor. No, this flight is a top-secret mission. Unless when you return, you're willing to try again. Tell me this when I do get back. The navigator used a tone with certainty. You will. You will? Liu Qingpeng didn't believe this at all. No one was more familiar with the machine than himself. The flight distance of 30 million kilometers was more than 10 times the normal cruising radius of the Stingray A1, especially for a dangerous flight outside the Earth-Moon system. Even if there was a quantum computer navigating for him, his probability of survival was only 10%. He wasn't most worried about not catching up to Earth. Instead, he was most worried about being unable to slow down due to the lack of fuel and overshooting to become a ghost in the solar system. All sacrifices, just for a look. But he didn't regret it because he accepted the task. Finally, taking one last breath of the air in Celestial City, he resolutely pressed the takeoff button next to the control. The robotic arm that pulled the Stingray A1 slowly moved, grabbed it from the airport, and stuffed it in the dark runway. The lights on the runway were turned on one by one, but they were still unable to illuminate the runway hundreds of kilometers of long. The blue arc began to swim on the edge of the spacecraft. In order to prevent his retinas from falling off, Liu Qingpeng chose to close his eyes. Whenever he lay on this runway, he felt like a shell and was stuffed into the electromagnetic pulse cannon. The navigator's undulating voice rang in his ears. Ejection countdown: 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. For a moment, every single cell in his body felt like it was being torn apart. Liu Qingpeng knocked his teeth, then used all his perseverance he had ever in his life to resist the tear of the acceleration while silently counting seconds in his heart. The torment lasted for a whole minute, and the force squeezing on his shoulders suddenly disappeared. When he opened his eyes again, Celestial City had turned into a ring, and he was in the starry sky. From a distance, the blue arc of the launching port in the center only flashed for a moment, and a black spot was thrown into the vast universe. Compared to the entire Earth, this Stingray was like a boat sailing into the vast sea, small and fragile. Earth's civilization, like a newborn child, reached out to the unknown existence for the first time. Before he had time to reminisce about the gradually disappearing Earth, The voice of the navigator rang out again. "Check the weapon system, Roger." Liu Qingpeng pressed the red button next to the control and two thick long tubes popped under the Stingray A1, slowly opening the two wings. At the same time, under the command of the navigator, he released the safety and pressed twice. The glaring white light flashed, and several laser beams that were as thick as a thigh fired into the distance and disappeared into the darkness. "The weapon system is functional," Liu Qingpeng reported and closed the safety. Although his mission was just to take a look, no one could guarantee if the UFO had friendly intentions. The Stingray A1 was equipped with the most powerful extraterrestrial attack weapon of celestial trade, the A-type attack module designed by the Pan-Asia Cooperation of the Apocalypse. If the UFO displayed an aggressive behavior after he approached, Celestial Trade permitted him to use his judgment. After escaping the gravity of the Earth-Moon system, Liu Qingpeng opened the throttle valve of the engine and accelerated to the marker in the field of view. When the speed stabilized above the second cosmic speed, he immediately turned off the throttle and began a long wait. It would take nearly 2.6 million seconds to catch up with the UFO. Nearly a month turned into days. It was naturally impossible for such a small spacecraft to have a complete ecological circulatory function. Fresh water, liquid food, and oxygen stored under sufficient power could only be maintained for about 15 days. However, Celestial Trade had specifically modified the spacecraft with a hibernation chamber. For a long time, he would spend his hours sleeping. When approaching the target, Ground Command Center would wake him up. Of course, it didn't rule out another possibility. It was force majeure, such as the sudden acceleration of the target that changed the position, so he passed by the target. If Ground Command Center judged that his remaining fuel couldn't allow him to catch up with the target, Ground Command Center would wake him up in advance to return. The temperature in the cockpit began to decrease, and the life maintenance device injected a special cell stabilizer into Liu Qingpeng. With his hands off the control, his sight began to blur and he eventually fell into darkness. In Ground Command Center, Zhang Chen watched Stingray A1 successfully entering the orbit and his clenched fists gradually loosened. Although the matter was delegated to Kelvin, he had to came to the command center and watch the hero fly into the night on the day when the volunteer set sail. "It's over," Kelvin whispered as he bumped Zhang Chen with his elbow. Zhang Chen nodded. He didn't say anything, then took a final look at the Stingray on the holographic screen before walking out. Although they had yet to be in contact with the UFO, witnessing this incident had a profound impact on the research direction of Celestial Trade. Based on Zhang Chen's instructions, Kelvin raised the research budget of the interplanetary engine for the first time, and at the same time, he included the extraterritorial attack method for the first time in the scientific research sequence. Zhang Chen originally planned to take it slow since the existing science wasn't enough to support powerful weapon technology. It was like black gunpowder on a musket. Without the formula for the gunpowder, no matter how the ancient craftsmen studied the weapons, they could only figure out how to sharpen bows and spears, not create a powerful musket. Before the breakthrough of the magnetic confinement technology in the Apocalypse, laser weapons were generally regarded as the most promising method of extraterrestrial attack. The A-type attack module designed by Pan-Asia Cooperation was designed based on this concept. However, after the breakthrough of magnetic confinement technology, the plasma gun that directly emitted high-temperature plasma became a more promising option. However, now, sharpening the bow and spear was the more urgent option. Regardless of whether the UFO was hostile or not, Celestial Trade, the representative of the civilization from Earth, would not show any weakness against the unknown force. Chapter 984 An Invite from Moscow. After leaving Ground Command Center, Zhang Chen returned to the future building by helicopter. The helicopter arrived, Zhang Chen stepped onto the landing pad on the roof, then returned to the office. Zhang Chen sunk into his chair as he picked up the documents on the table. Aisha's figure then appeared behind him, her hands gently placed on his shoulders, then she massaged. There was a subtle but warm smile on his face. He flipped through the document about the application of the space station interface by Hua Heavy Industries, then he asked, Is there anything new in Europe? Aisha shook her head with some regret. We were a step late. Glenn Krupp was dead. His body was found on a farm in the suburbs of Falkford the day before yesterday by a farmer. He was shot in the chest and no one knew why he appeared there. Now the head of the Krupp family is his brother, Leon Krupp. If there was anyone who could stop Carmen, it would probably be the Krupp family representing the Prussian aristocracy. Their achievements in the industrial field were equivalent to Rothschild's financial dominance. From the Prussian era, whether it was a big factory or a small workshop, they liked to put the Krupp logo on the barrel to indicate that they were using high-quality gun steel from Krupp, which showed its profound influence. Not everyone liked to see Europe moving toward unity, or most people didn't want to see this day. The Rothschild family could manipulate the polls by selecting an extreme right government. Through the media, they could alter what some people thought, but ultimately, they couldn't avoid the Krupp family born in the traditional Prussian aristocracy and Glenn Krupp, who was the Duke of Prussia. In Jiang Chen's plan, if he could pull Glenn Krupp into his forces, he should be able to dismantle the Freemasonry from the inside, thus aborting the Rothschilds' family plan. But now it seemed that Carmen wasn't stupid enough to let go of this hidden danger, and he acted before the ghost agents found Glenn Krupp. Jiang Chen had a headache and pinched his eyebrows. Just then, his watch shook. A holographic image opened. It was a long-distance call from Moscow. After Jiang Chen thought for a second, he answered the phone. "Hey, it's me," Natasha said. "I'm relieved to hear your voice. It seems that you haven't suffered a tragedy in Cain," Jiang Chen joked. "I'm very busy now, no time to joke." Natasha took a deep breath and went on. "I have something. Or Russia wants to talk to you." Jiang Chen's finger gently tapped the table. "Let's talk." "I'm listening." "I don't want to disclose the details over the phone. There will be an important person who will talk to you in detail. If it's convenient, can you come to Moscow, Brussels, Belgium, the location of European Union's headquarters?" A week ago, the EU foreign minister announced the establishment of a controversial EU integration resolution. All the EU reporters and protesters were gathered there. Today, because of a special meeting, the government officials of many EU countries were all in this place. In order to avoid accidents, Belgium even dispatched the famous Special Operations Brigade, SFG, to take charge of the security. With the aid of the Special Task Police, the Belgian police successfully dispersed the protesters blocking the entrance to the EU headquarters to ensure that the high-level meeting was successfully completed. After the meeting, with the protection of bodyguards, the New Choice Party leader, the Chancellor of Germany, Peter, walked through the reporters with a stern expression. Although the bodyguards blocked the way, the microphones reached out one by one. The police dared to drive away the violent protesters, but they didn't dare to scare away reporters. "Mr. Chancellor, how will the integration of the EU take place?" asked a British reporter. "It will start as soon as possible before our economic situation and employment rate get worse." Many countries in the EU have expressed opposition. The conservative groups in Frankfurt have also clearly expressed their opposition to this resolution. What choices will the New Choice Party take in the future? A reporter from a German television station asked. "We will allow them to trust me," Peter said with patience. "Do you have any opinions on the EU moving toward the United Nations? Does the United Kingdom have any opposition?" asked a reporter from a Belgian newspaper. "Their opinions are not important. This is a European affair, not British. They have left the EU and we have no plans to let them back." How will EU integration help Greece and other countries get rid of the debt crisis, and will the merger of the EU's territories make the economically backward member countries further hinder Frankfurt's economy? A reporter from the asked. "We will come up with an effective plan to let the unemployed find a job instead of wasting euros borrowed from our bank." Finally, Peter got rid of the annoying reporters. He heaved a sigh of relief and sat in a black limousine. The 50-meter-long journey was almost as exhausting as running a marathon. Yes, exhausting. New Choice Party was regarded as the inheritor of the extreme right because of the ideals of exiting the Eurozone, recovering border control and shooting refugees, but now, they not only failed to fulfill their campaign promises, but they overthrew everything they promised and chose to work with friends to establish a unified EU. Not only did he oppose the decision, but many voters who voted for them also opposed. He didn't know why he was standing here and voted for a proposal he didn't agree with. But by being in this position, he didn't have a lot of choices. The New Choice Party wasn't Merkel's party. They were really too young. From formation to taking the office, they hadn't accumulated enough chips to negotiate with the major European consortiums. This political power yet to take its shape was too fragile in front of Rothschild's capital. Perhaps Merkel had the temper to oppose that man, but he wasn't Merkel. He was nothing but a puppet of the Rothschild family, the same kind of puppet who existed almost everywhere in the Bundestag, in every corner of the New Choice Party, and even in the military. If he dared to show any dissent, stepping down was probably the most decent tending. He admitted that although he didn't know how far this EU integration resolution could go and how long it would last, the man named Kármán was already halfway to the feats that Napoleon, William II, and Hitler never achieved. He even started to regret the choice he made. When Peter got into the car, an old man in a suit had been sitting in the car for a long time. Seeing the Chancellor, the old man expressed his respect by bowing his head. After the door was closed, Peter cleared his throat. The resolution to remove the authority of central banks in the European Central Bank system has been passed. The next step is for the ECB to control the central banks and gradually withdraw the right to issue euros from the EU countries. You are doing very well. The old man smiled, who voted against it. The feeling of being stared at by the poisonous snake made Peter suffocate a little, but he soon returned to normal and shook his head. With the exception of 2 abstentions, no one objected. The old man smiled and nodded. Out of the anxiousness for the country's destiny, Peter added, "Do you think this is really good?" When the old man looked at him, he quickly added, "I mean, from an economic point of view. The concentration of the distribution rights of the euro may increase the economic burden of Greece, Italy, Portugal." The old man just smiled and didn't answer this question. The EU will be more dynamic than ever, whether in economics or influence. Peter shrugged and looked away. At a glimpse, he got the illusion that the entrepreneur or butler trained by the Rothschild consortium in front of him was more like a politician. Chapter 985 Preparation before the departure. If it is convenient, can you come to Moscow? After thinking for a moment, Zhang Chen didn't reject Natasha's invitation. If he must make a trip to Moscow, then it must be inconvenient to discuss on the phone and it must be a topic not appropriate to delegate to a diplomat. His intuition told him it must be related to stormy Europe. Russia was one of the strategic partners of celestial trade. The economic cooperation between the two was second only to Hua, and their military cooperation was even above that with Hua. From this perspective alone, he should go there in person. The integration of Europe was also inconsistent with the interests of celestial trade. After hanging up the phone, Zhang Chen looked to Aisha. He dragged her hand closer to his face as he smiled and whispered, "Sorry to bother you." "No worries." Aisha's hand was gently placed on Zhang Chen's hand, indulging in the intimate moment. She closed her eyes. "It's my pleasure to share your worries. Isn't this supposed to be what a gentleman tells a lady?" Zhang Chen said. Aisha smiled and started the optical invisibility to hide her figure in the office. Since playing a virtual reality game called Assassin's Creed, Phantom in the Phantom Helmet, she had fallen in love with using stealth to bid farewell. He felt a gentleness and warmth on his forehead, and soon, a gust of wind swept through the office. Zhang Chen touched his forehead, and he smiled. This little girl secretly kissed him. The more eastward, the weaker the influence of the Freemasonry, but even the KGB couldn't guarantee that Moscow, the capital in Eastern Europe, didn't have informants of the Freemasonry. Risks and benefits were always proportional. In order to ensure the safety of his trip to Moscow, Aisha headed to Moscow first. She used the intelligence network established by the ghost agents in the local area to clear potential dangers for Zhang Chen's visit while having the smallest possibility of offending his allies. The date of the visit was set a week later in the name of the submarine transmission cable. Before going to Russia, Zhang Chen didn't just take time off, but he returned to the apocalypse. At the beginning of April, the heavy snow over Wanghai finally stopped, and the snow covering the ruins of the city also showed signs of melting. This winter came earlier than before, and it also left much later. The entire Earth was like a computer that had been put into excessive use by the countries. After hundreds of years of high usage, it finally restarted because of the global nuclear war. The facts confirmed the speculation of the Dusk Church. After many years of silence, the world welcomed a little ice age far more severe compared to the one in medieval times. A disaster caused by the nuclear winter was wrapped in the roaring snow and covered the whole Earth. In the coldest days, Zhang Chen basically spent his time in the modern world, only occasionally coming back to accompany his girls to eat hot pot, so he didn't personally experience the harsh winter. According to Sun Zhao, Wanghai and Yizhou Island were okay. In Hongcheng and Wu City, which were more inland, many survivors froze to death. The Little Ice Age ultimately impacted the development of 6th Street. The proclaimed trade center that connected the survivors of the North and the South had a looming hint of depression because of the influence of the winter last year. Although the irreplaceable food trade maintained a considerable degree of vitality, population growth still slowed down. People became more inclined to find a suitable place to live in the South. At that moment, Zhang Chen began to understand why the Northern Alliance area forcefully declared a war on him even with their fragile supply line. It wasn't that they were crazy, but they were forced to do so. Inheriting the armed forces of the pre-war Pan-Asia Cooperation and uniting the mutants who fled from Hongcheng to the vicinity of Wu City, they achieved some success. If it wasn't for the breakthrough in magnetic confinement technology combined with the strong industrial capabilities of 6th Street, which allowed the frontline troops to successfully install the plasma cannons, the Northern Alliance area would likely be attacking Hong City or might have even already reached the gate of Nak, Heng City. However, that was only a what-if. When Zhang Chen returned to the apocalypse, the welcome he was expecting didn't happen, and the mansion was quiet. Sun Zhao and Sun Ziru needed to handle his affairs for him when he returned to the modern world, although Sun Zhao, who used to act leisurely, hated the job. However, she still bore the responsibility for Zhang Chen. As for Linling, because of the research, she went out to camp number 27. That was to say that at the moment at home, only Yao Yao lived in the boudoir every day, and this information was exactly what Zhang Chen heard from the girl's mouth, that, "Can you come down from my lap?" The soft jade was warm in his arms, and Zhang Chen had scratched his cheeks with some cramps. At the moment, Yao Yao, wearing floral dress pajamas, sat happily on his lap with two happily swaying small feet wrapped in white silk. Even her bunny slippers were kicked to the side. A fluttering scent came along her fluffy hair, and the soft sound seemed to have a sweet scent. Her deer-like watery eyes shone with the hope that she wouldn't be rejected. Can you hold Yao Yao for a while?" Turning his head slightly, Yao Yao whispered. "No problem. How long will it take?" Zhang Chen replied immediately. "Yes, I can't refuse it." Even Zhang Chen, who occasionally revealed the side of his deep heart, couldn't bear to see the lonely expression on the face of the little angel. Thinking about it anyway, there was nothing to do. Zhang Chen sighed and smacked the hair of Yao Yao and recited something in his heart more than a dozen times. "I am not Ilwo, Li control." He decided to remain at the side of the little girl and stay for a while. Feeling the warmth of his head, the expression on Yao Yao's face was satisfying, and he happily picked up the song. The current sound of the chassis was looming, and Zhang Chen looked around Yao Yao's boudoir. There had been little change in everything there over the years. In addition to the bed and furniture replaced with new products imported from the new country, the pink girlish wallpaper and the electronic components emitting a metal flavor didn't make up everything in her room. There were more and more books on the shelves. Looking at one book, Zhang Chen thought, "I think that should be a relatively high-end computer professional book." Feeling that Yao Yao had grown up, Zhang Chen couldn't help but caress her hair and say with emotion, "Speaking of which, is Yao Yao not growing up at all?" "Hey." Being poked painfully, her small shoulders shook. Yao Yao's mouth pricked up slightly, her throat snorting with some frustration. "This room is definitely not big enough. Remember to go out to do some sports, at least in the backyard." Zhang Chen suddenly realized that the sun was shining through the yellow-green tone of the dust. It seemed that it wasn't as healthy as indoor lighting. Yao Yao shrank and whispered, "Hey, big brother, don't you like girls who are smaller?" This wasn't a minor category, this was young. The teeth weren't over. Moreover, this wasn't the focus at all. Zhang Chen couldn't help but tap her head with his fingers. "I'm worried about your health. How can you think about that?" "Hey," with hands clasped together, covering the big hand that caressed the top of her head, on Yao Yao's mouth hung a sweet smile. Although she was counting down, she always felt warm in her heart. It was like a vacant place, filled with the same. Chapter 986 Heart to Heart in the office. Zhang Chen stayed in Yao Yao's room with her until 5 o'clock. Soon after, Lin Lin returned from Camp 27 and Sun Zhao and Ziru also finished their work and returned home. The satisfied Yao Yao jumped off of Zhang Chen's legs. She took the apron from the closet and tied it around her petite body. "There is delicious steamed fish tonight. Big brother can look forward to it." The little Lilai with a red hue on her face skipped out the door. Listening to the cheerful tunes from the corridor, a heartfelt smile appeared on his face. As he stood up and began to walk to the living room, he bumped into Sun Zhao. When she saw Zhang Chen, she immediately jumped into his arms and kissed him on the face. Ziru with her watery eyes looked at their public displays of affection and giggled while covering her mouth. Lin Lin was the only one who couldn't stand them. After she bad-mouthed the two, she rolled her eyes and hid into her lab while, because Zhang Chen was back, dinner was more lively. After dinner, Zhang Chen helped Yao Yao and Ziru clean up the dishes. Then he went to the third-floor office. Pushing open the door, Zhang Chen found Sun Zhao standing in front of the window, looking at him with a smile. "I knew you would come here." She walked to him and put her arms around his neck as she gazed into his pupils with longing and unspoken thoughts. Zhang Chen smoothly closed the door behind him. Then, he kissed her lips with affection and looked into the eyes fixated on him. "I knew you would be waiting for me here. Now there is no one around here. Let's wait until this evening." Sun Zhao began to blush as her lips curled. She placed her chin on Zhang Chen's shoulder and closed her eyes in joy. "Now, I want to be hugged by you like this." Leaning against the window of the office, looking at the snow that has almost completely melted, Zhang Chen was feeling the warmth and tenderness in his arms. From the distance, he vaguely heard singing in the quietness. "People are singing outside?" Zhang Chen asked casually as he looked out the window. "The spring concert is being held by a large orchestra in the 6th Street. The performance will continue from 8 o'clock to 12 o'clock. We can't hear clearly from here, but if you are interested, we can go to the performance," Sun Zhao suggested. "I'll pass. I'm not really interested in a concert." Zhang Chen shook his head. "But it is good to hold this kind of an event, especially in peaceful times." With resources becoming more and more abundant, the lives of the survivors were also becoming richer. When these people no longer needed to fight in the front line with guns, they needed to seek some recreations for entertainment. More cultural activities would not only promote social stability but also teach these survivors the concept of civilization. There are quite a few female celebrities from before the war. "Do you want me to hold a contest for you?" While in Zhang Chen's arms, Sun Zhao mocked and gently poked at his ribs. "A lot of people are interested in your heroic deeds. I don't have any heroic deeds." Zhang Chen coughed and looked away in awkwardness. Sun Zhao didn't say anything and simply smiled at him. As the closest woman to him, she has witnessed everything: the downfall of the mutated humans, the eradication of the mutant flood, the recovery of the city center, the destruction of the runaway artificial intelligence, and the salvation of Hongcheng and Yaizhou. Each merit alone could make a person's name known on the wasteland. And when these achievements are all condensed onto one person, no matter how humble, he is worthy of the hero title. It was like this for a long time. The stability of NAC never relied on citizenship, but instead relied on the personal prestige of the general. "Let's not talk about this, right? Is there any news on the Guardian sect?" When Zhang Chen began to mention important matters, Sun Zhao didn't leave his arms, but she stopped giggling. After thinking for a moment, she replied, "They sent 50 technicians from Shangjing. They were in charge of maintaining the Holy Shield system before the war. After the war, they also participated in related projects for the space colonization ship." Zhang Chen had to interrupt when he heard this. Pan-Asia Cooperation didn't bring these talents with them. The space colonization ship can't take everyone away, and there is no need to take everyone away. At least, this was Lu Minghui's explanation. Sun Jiao briefly explained and returned to the main topic. "At the beginning of last month, we started the maintenance work of the Holy Shield system, but repairs of this scale are not an overnight job. When will they be done?" Zhang Chen asked. Sun Jiao shook her head. "I don't know, maybe this year, maybe next year, maybe it will never be repaired. But now, according to the feedback from the engineers on our side, we have not encountered any issues we can't solve." Zhang Chen nodded. "With the arrival of the Little Ice Age, winter will only be longer and more severe than last year. It would be best if they could repair the Holy Shield system before October. But if that was not possible, they must spend more effort on winterization." To be prepared, before he left last time, he had given Lu Huasheng orders to begin cleaning up Wanghai Metro Line 1. He had set aside a budget to purchase heating facilities, temporary living spaces, and set up necessities production workshops in the metro. If the living environment of the surface is too severe, at least the civilians of the 6th Street could spend the winter underground. Right. Recently a new fallout shelter opened in the northern suburbs of Hongqiang. The director of the refugee shelter accepted our proposal and agreed to merge under the banner of NAC, but after accepting the status quo of the surface, he hopes to see you. Sun Jiao suddenly remembered and mentioned this. "Oh, where is he now?" Zhang Chen said. If he was close, Zhang Chen could go see him. But if he was too far away, he couldn't see him since he only planned to stay for a short time. At the 6th Street, Zhang Chen nodded. "I am going to see an old friend there tomorrow. Let him wait in the Parliament building." The Blueskins may not understand the world, perhaps not welcomed by survivors, but for Zhang Chen, who hopes to rebuild order on this wasteland, these people are the most precious resources on this wasteland. Even if they are not scientists, even if they are just ordinary people, they are all well educated and have the order that has long been annihilated in the ruins that belong to civilization. The seed of civilization is not germinated by guns and cannons. When these people from before the war successfully integrated into this post-war Okati, perhaps they will bring a precious and unique inspiration to NAC's path to the future. Based on this alone, Zhang Chen felt that it was necessary to have a good conversation with the director. Chapter 987 The Fate of Fallout Shelter 118. It was already late into the night when the light in the office went out. When Zhang Chen brought Sun Jiao into the bathroom, then into the bedroom, and then till the room returned to silence, the hour hand had already passed the 12 o'clock position. With Sun Jiao peacefully sleeping in his arm, Zhang Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead and collapsed into the pillows. The desk lamp on the bedside table was turned off, and Zhang Chen pulled up the quilt. They started when they were taking a shower, and because he used up too much of his stamina, he quickly drifted to sleep. A silent night. The next morning, after eating breakfast with the girls, Zhang Chen, Sun Jiao, and Ziru went out together. After dropping the girls off at the community center, he took the long way to the warehouses of the Fishbone base before heading to the helipad. Although the Fishbone base is strictly speaking a military area, with the increase in population and the natural buff of the NAC capital, the development speed here was not inferior to any economic zone within the NAC. This was evident based on the growing number of warehouses and the number of people traversing between the warehouses. In Zhang Chen's memory, at the early stage of the Fishbone base, there were only a few small warehouses that stored the materials from the modern world. Now, the area completely turned into a cargo distribution center at a size only second to the 6th Street's cargo distribution center. Not far from the airship ports, giant mechanical arms were loading cargo onto a helium airship set to fly to Hongqiang. Most of the supplies sent to Hongqiang were arms and some grains produced in the Garden of Eden. After his short tour, Zhang Chen came to transport Helicopter 51. The young man piloting saw him and immediately saluted. Then he hopped into the helicopter and started the engine, transporting Zhang Chen to the 6th Street. Heavy snow hindered the population's growth but didn't freeze the prosperity of the 6th Street. Looking from above, the size of the 6th Street more than doubled compared to last year. The trade interrupted by heavy snow resumed with the spring breeze, and wasteland traders from all over Wasteland swarmed to the 6th Street. After the helicopter landed, Zhang Chen went to the Parliament building. Members of the 6th Street Council were in a meeting, so Zhang Chen did not bother them. After chatting with the security officer on duty, he came to the general office on the top floor of the Parliament building. Other than the cleaning staff who come here regularly, this office was mostly empty. Located in the middle of the top floor of the Parliament building, it served as a symbolic presence. The offices of the executives of the 6th Street were beside it. Like a magic trick, Zhang Chen took out a small can of coffee beans from the Blue Mountains of Jamaica and tossed it to the assistant in Chunan's office. After asking her to make him a pot of coffee, he also requested she brings the fallout shelter director to him. After a little while, a pot of aromatic coffee was placed on his desk. Zhang Chen poured a cup for himself. The thick white mist was still lingering above the coffee when a polite knock was heard on the door. "Please come in." The door opened, and a young man walked in. When he saw the pot of coffee on the table, his expression changed and his eyes widened, but soon he calmed himself down and stood in front of Zhang Chen. "Please feel to sit," Zhang Chen said with a smile, made a gesture to the chair next to him, and at the same time poured a cup of coffee for him. "Thank you." The young man nodded politely. After tasting the coffee, he said with some emotions, "The nostalgic taste reminds me of the morning before the nuclear war broke out. This should be expensive in the apocalypse, right?" "Yes, after all, after more than 20 years, even with the best preservation technique, everything would almost be expired by now," Zhang Chen said with a smile. "I heard you wanted to see me. Now that you have seen me, what do you want to talk about?" The young man nodded. "Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lu Yue, Director of Fallout Shelter 118. When the door of Fallout Shelter 118 opened, we met the messenger sent by you and learned about what happened on the surface." Lu Yue paused, and then said with reminiscence, "Before the door opened, we had imagined the end of the war but did not expect the final outcome to be like this. No victorious country, no defeated country. It's all happened over 20 years ago." Zhang Chen looked at the clock on the wall. "Do you just want to talk to me about this?" Lu Yue shook his head. "Number, to be precise. I am going to give you something." As he spoke, he took off the pendant hanging on his neck and gently placed it on the table. Zhang Chen leaned forward and looked at the pendant on the table. The silver ring had strange patterns carved into it, and in the center of the ring, there was a ruby the size of a grain of rice. It just looked like an ordinary accessory. Zhang Chen looked confused. He did not understand why he was given this. This is a key," Lu Yue said while looking at Zhang Chen. "It is also the mission of Fallout Shelter 118. Can you elaborate?" Zhang Chen asked. Unlike most social experimental fallout shelters as well as fallout shelters with the purpose of preserving population, the meaning of our existence is only to leave a little hope for the possibly dark future, Lu Yue said, as he gently pushed the key in front of Zhang Chen. At the bottom of the Poyang Lake next to Hongcheng, there is a completely dormant fallout shelter, coded T7. 2,000 researchers are lying in those hibernation chambers. Their professions cover a total of 167 fields from particle physics to aerospace technology. They will sleep through the passage of time until someone opens the fallout shelter, wake them up and take their knowledge from under the ruins. Fallout Shelter T7 was not constructed as part of the Fallout Shelter project. The construction party of the shelter is the Pan-Asia Cooperation Science Research Institute, and the project is called Seed of Civilization. Over the past few days in the 6th Street, I did see the germination of civilization. I hope that you can make good use of these researchers and revitalize the glory of civilization on this land. Under the sunlight, The rice-sized ruby cast a faint ray called hope. Picking the pendant up from the table, Zhang Chen solemnly said, "Thank you." "You're welcome. I should be the one saying thank you. I have already planned to treat this as an heirloom. I didn't expect that I can fulfill my mission in my lifetime." Lu Yue stood up, bowed to Zhang Chen, and left the office. Chapter 988 Private Talk. The Modern World. At a suburb estate of a small town in Frankfurt, a plain black car was parked in front of the manor's driveway. Two big men in suits came up to check the identity of the people inside. They whispered into the intercom before the gate slowly opened, letting the car with Frankfurt's Prime Minister roll in. "What's the purpose of the flashlights in their hands?" Peter asked the old man sitting next to him. Although it looked like a flashlight, no light illuminated from it. "A tool for catching mice, especially invisible mice." The old man smiled and rolled up his sleeve to check the time. "Master Carmen will wait for you in the office. I have something to do later, so I won't accompany you." Peter forced a smile and did not continue the conversation. Upon his return from Belgium, he ran immediately to the federal parliament. Once there, he spent the day yelling with a bunch of aggressive idiots, and because he was unable to withstand the pressure, he was forced to disband the meeting and seek help from his behind-the-scenes master, Carmen Rothschild. On the phone, Carmen did not immediately tell him what to do. Instead, he asked him to come to his estate. After hanging up the phone, Peter immediately told his assistant to clear his schedule and rushed to Carmen's estate. "The opposition parties are driving me crazy." Peter, with his hands on his head, walked into Carmen's office and tossed a transcript of the meeting on his desk. "The Prussian Solidarity Party called for a referendum in the Prussian region and is seeking federal independence. There is also the Forward Union asking me to resign immediately. Otherwise, they will impeach me through the federal parliament." He did not come empty-handed. The transcript of the meeting detailed the dissent and political demands of the opposition parties. If the parties do not resolve their differences, Frankfurt may collapse before the European integration process even begins. Carmen did not go look at the transcript. He simply crossed his fingers and leaned back in his chair. "Don't be nervous, my dear Mr. Peter. We have an absolute advantage in Parliament. Their impeachment will not be successful." Carmen looked in the direction of his housekeeper. "Graham, go and tell the kitchen to prepare an extra set of cutleries for the dinner table today." The old butler standing next to him nodded and left the room. Seeing that the unrelated person has left the room, Peter grabbed a chair, sat across from Carmen, and began to complain to his old friend. After getting along for so many years, he knew his old friend very well. The bastard called Carmen Rothschild does not mind people complaining to him about work, as long as they didn't stand on the opposite side. But the voice of questioning is not just from the opposition parties, but also from within our new choice party. "Then you will explain everything to them," Carmen said with a smile. Originally, he wanted to first slow down the European Union integration and soften the attitude of those who oppose it. After all, their anger seemed to be pointing toward a revolution. From any perspective, it seemed like pushing for the integration resolution was a futile and reckless move. Just looking at the attitude of Mr. Carmen, he seemed to have no intention of listening to persuasion. But this is impossible. You can never convince two people who are not willing to be together to hold hands. Just like no one can convince the Germans and the French to live under the same roof. Now Frankfurt is opposed to the European Union integration. The same is true of our allies. My chief of staff can write a speech for me, but even if I am clever, I can't turn black into white. Carmen interrupted Peter, who was in obvious distress, and explained patiently. "You are wrong, my friend. Black, of course, can be white. Not only that, as long as you use the proper method, ugly can be beautiful, weak can be great, ridiculous can be reasonable, and pain can be happiness. The only one who can do this is God." Peter ridiculed himself. "And there is only a poor man standing in front of you." Carmen shook his head. "The opposite is true. God has never succeeded in doing this. Only men have succeeded." "Ah, dear Mr. Carmen, how are you going to make the sky green?" Peter laughed. Then pulling on his hair, he said in agony, "Tell me, What should I do now? What you have to do is not explain. Always remember that people are never creatures that can be convinced, just as there is no truth in this world. Carmen shook his head and raised a finger. What you need to do is give them a reason for believing. How to make one believe the sky is green. A color blindness diagnosis is far more effective than an impassioned speech. Peter was stunned and stared at Carmen blankly. He felt like a door just opened in his head. After that flash of ingenious, he seemed to have caught on to something. People are against us. Don't try to convince them to put down their prejudice. Just give them a reason to. We need a war, and then broadcast it on our TV to render the horror and brutality of this war. If you want to find a goal that will make the Germans and the French stand together, Russia is a good choice. It happens that our Ukrainian brothers are in a bad spot right now. We don't even need to do anything new. We just need to use the appropriate tools. Carmen spun the globe on the table and smiled. For example, let people believe that the crisis of aggression is imminent. Ukraine is the outpost of Europe. We are not uniting for the selfish desires of the capitalists or the ambitions of the politicians, but for unity. Get up and fight against the common enemies of Europe. Don't forget your identity. The New Choice Party is an extreme right party. Carmen patted Peter's chest with the back of his hand. Unemployment, economic crisis, refugee problems, energy shortages. Use your imagination. Everything is the fault of Russians. Remember, not only the parliament members but the mouthpieces of the mainstream European media are also in our hands. Peter felt like his brain was never clearer. He already understood what he needed to do. As for what to do, Carmen pointed to his head. Think about it here. Think about it. If you can't think of it, find someone to think for you. Who should I look for? Peter was still stunned and asked subconsciously. Belgium is one of the EU member states and has the highest welfare. You mean I should go to the Belgian president and exchange ideas? Peter raised his eyebrow. No, you don't need to exchange ideas with the Belgian president, you just need to be a new consultant. Chapter 989 The Treasure Buried Deep. Several boats with the NAC symbol quietly drifted in the middle of Poyang Lake. Soldiers wearing kinetic skeletons stood on the boat and carefully observed their surroundings. On the wasteland, places with water are always more dangerous than places without water. Behind every plant could be a mud crab. A mud crab covered with heavy armor could match the deadliest mutant, the Death Claws. Wearing a black lacquered power armor, Zhang Chen stood at the bow and looked into the bottomless lake. Ripples disturbed the clear water. If he didn't receive strong evidence, he wouldn't believe such an amazing secret would be buried under this lake. 2,000 scientists with extensive research fields. This treasure is crucial for Zhang Chen. After a while, a knight walked behind him and bowed respectfully. Observers have used a life wave detection device. There is no trace of mud crab activity in the area. Our people are ready to go. Then let's go now. Zhang Chen ordered. Yes, Hu Cheng saluted. His fist slamming on the steel armor made a clear sound. Under the leadership of the NAC Knight, 5 soldiers wearing amphibious kinetic skeletons quickly gathered at the bow and jumped into the lake. Zhang Chen stood in the bow and waited quietly until the underwater team confirmed the safety of the lake, and then stepped into the lake. As a single armor that can cross the nuclear radiation area, the average depth of only 10 meters is nothing for the T3 power armor. It didn't take long before Zhang Chen's feet stood on the soft lake bottom. A few mutated fishes swam to him and began to bite at the steel armor. Zhang Chen waved his hands and shooed these self-humiliating mutants away before moving toward the location marked on the holographic screen. Unlike most fallout shelters, this fallout shelter was not documented. The circular entrance had a diameter of 10 meters. It was not embedded in the wall but placed at the bottom of a lake. Time did not leave any rust on its body. The bright alloy made it seem like it was only dropped here yesterday. In the center of this giant round door, T7 was painted. This is it. A string of bubbles squeezed out from the gap in the knight's armor. Zhang Chen looked at the knight and nodded. He took out the ruby pendant and walked toward the center of the steel door. Let me do it. Hu Qing hurriedly tried to stop the general. As a knight of the NAC, how could he let the general make risky moves? However, Zhang Chen just shook his head. It's over. The possibility of traps being here is low. Fallout Shelter 118 already joined under the banner of NAC. Lu Yue has no reason to lie. Only graves need to have traps protecting them. If the purpose of this Fallout Shelter is to send knowledge and hope to the future, then the person who built the shelter has no reason to put weapons in it. In the center of the steel giant door, just as Lu Yue described, there was a circular print engraved into it. Zhang Chen put the end of the pendant inside and gently rotated it half a turn to the right. The ruby embedded in this pendant was the key to opening the door. The ruby had been specifically designed and processed so that over 10 gigabytes of passwords could be engraved within it. This encryption method made it so that even a quantum computer's computing power would not be sufficient in deciphering all the passwords. The current followed the silver disk and passed through the ruby. A string of bubbles formed from the edge of the round steel door and pushed toward the surface. With a slight tremor, the giant door slowly began to sink. It's not quite right here, General. Please come out first. Hu Qing looked around nervously and immediately stood in front of Zhang Chen. 5 soldiers wearing amphibious kinetic skeletons also nervously raised their underwater rifles and watched for possible threats. Don't be nervous, it's just an elevator. Zhang Chen smiled and shook his head. He pressed down on the muzzle and indicated for everyone to remain calm. With the steel giant door slowly sinking, after less than half a minute, the giant door that originally protruded onto the surface became a deep pit. When the giant door sunk to a certain height, the entire giant door clinked into place like a bullet being loaded. The roof of the deep pit began to converge, like a dome, covering everyone's head and sealing the exit. When the dome was completely closed, the signal light in the deep pit turned on, illuminating the entire space. Then, the water level began to fall. After the water was completely pumped out, a door formed on the vertical well wall. It seems like this is not a door, but an elevator. Hu Qing examined his surrounding and discovered that he was surrounded by steel walls. He put down his rifle and muttered to himself before grabbing the tactical rifle around his waist. Zhang Chen had already stepped in front of the open door, but just as he was about to cross the door, he stopped and frowned. On the open iron gate, he saw a familiar sign. He gently touched the raised badge. The soft titanium on his fingertips followed the engraving and swept away the dust. If he remembers correctly, the company that owns this trademark has a famous name, East Asia Heavy Industries. Zhang Chen muttered, "What's wrong?" In muffled steps, Hu Qing walked in beside him. He raised his flashlight and pointed it into the darkness behind the door. But other than a narrow corridor, he couldn't see anything else. "Where is that pendant? Give it to me." Zhang Chen turned and looked at Hu Qing. "Roger." Hu Qing respectfully nodded, stepped back to the center of the giant circular door, kneeled down and removed the pendant out of the groove. After taking the pendant, Zhang Chen waved to soldiers behind him to follow him into the corridor. Under the leadership of Hu Qing, the 6 men guarded Zhang Chen. Soon, the group came to the end of the corridor. Zhang Chen took out the key again and swept it on a card reader on an alloy door. After reading the password in the ruby, the alloy door slowly opened. Then, cold lights gradually began to turn on, illuminating the space inside. Seeing the marvelous scene behind the door, Zhang Chen's pupils gradually widened, revealing his amazement. Just like terracotta warriors were in the giant space, there were about 2,000 oval-shaped hibernation chambers. The white shell looked like a large goose egg wrapped by arm-sized pipelines connected to the central main control computer and the life support device. This is not a fallout shelter, but a time machine, from the past decades to the future. It carried the seed of civilization. "Wait for me here." With inexplicable excitement in his heart, Zhang Chen moved the nearest giant egg. He reached out and pressed the button that said "End Hibernation." A neat seam formed on the shell and cold white mist spewed out of the gap. Just like sputum being reborn, the outer shell of the hibernation chamber slowly opened, revealing a girl lying in the shell with skin as fine as jade. However, when he saw the girl's face, his excited mood suddenly extinguished like a bucket of cold water was poured on his head. Suddenly, he thought of something. He jerked his head up and looked at the central computer. This familiar device, as if to confirm his guess. The dark display lit up and a suited man appeared in the center of the screen. He was sitting in an office chair and behind him was the skyline of Wanghai from before the war. The expressionless face seemed to state his lack of interest in anything. "Hello, future friends. From your expression, it seems that you have seen me from somewhere before?" Chapter 990. A blank sheet of paper. Jiang Chen, of course, has seen him before. Even if he has turned into dust, Jiang Chen would still remember that face. The face linked to the brain that was floating in the culture tank, and buried together with the Supreme. "We meet again, Dr. Lin Minji." Looking at the man on the screen, Jiang Chen sighed with some emotion, took the coat from the open hibernation chamber, and covered the girl. "I thought you were already dead. I didn't expect to see you alive." Although Dr. Lin Minji was much younger than the last time Jiang Chen saw him in the underground fallout shelter in Wanghai, he still recognized him from certain distinct facial features. The girl lying in the hibernation chamber also put a complex expression on his face. At the same time the screens lit up, Hu Cheng gestured and rushed forward with the soldiers in front of Jiang Chen. As he passed Jiang Chen, he caught sight of the girl in the hibernation chamber with the corner of his eye. He was shocked, but he quickly made the decision to ignore what he saw and focused his attention on the man on the screen. Although he didn't know who the person was, his instincts told him the man doesn't have the best relationship with the general. "Lin Minji? That is indeed my name." As if Lin Minji didn't see the rifles pointed at him, the man raised his head and looked at the non-existent ceiling and sighed in nostalgia. "Allow me to correct one thing. It is debatable if I am alive or not." "Debatable?" After hearing this sentence, Jiang Chen frowned and slowly lowered the rifle in his hand. "Now that you are calmer, no matter what conflicts you have with that person, isn't it pointless to be angry at a program?" Lin Minji opened his hands with a helpless expression. "I was born in 2168, almost at the same time as the fallout shelter was completed. My personality and other features are based on the programmer who wrote me." "Can I ask a question?" Jiang Chen asked. "Of course." Lin Minji slightly nodded. "Answering your questions is the meaning of my existence." "Which level of artificial intelligence are you? Basic, intermediate, or basic?" "Of course." Lin Minji smiled. "For a commentator, thinking is just cumbersome." Jiang Chen was silent for a long time. Then, he sent an order to Hu Cheng through the communication channel. "Wait for me outside," Hu Cheng hurriedly replied. "But, this is an order." Jiang Chen used an irrefutable tone and stopped his attempt to persuade. "Wait for me in the elevator. Unless I order, don't come in." For the knights, the command of the general is absolute. Although Hu Cheng was still concerned about the general's safety, he couldn't say more. He just reluctantly lowered his head and accepted the order. "Roger." Raising his hand, he gestured to his soldiers in the squad and took them to the corridor leading to the elevator. Standing at the door, he hesitantly took one last look at Jiang Chen's back before obeying his absolute order and retreating to the elevator. After the footsteps gradually drifted away, Jiang Chen was silent for a moment before asking, "Tell me, what are you doing?" "Leaving seeds for civilization." "These clones are what you call seeds?" Jiang Chen's rifle moved to the side and pointed to the girl who was looking at him with innocent eyes. Then, he said emotionlessly, "Or, is this some sort of sick experiment?" The girl lying in the hibernation chamber looked like an exact replica of Lin Lin. If she was not a special exception, then the 2,000 scientists lying here should all be replicas of Lin Lin. When Lin Minji heard Jiang Chen's words, he shook his head. "You've misunderstood." "Misunderstood?" "In my database, the key term seeds of civilization does not contain any words relating to experiment. The human female who is lying in front of your eyes is a clone born through the cell cloning technique with cells from an individual named Lin Lin. Her name is Lin Yi, number 0001. Jiang Chen was very curious. If number 0001 is called Lin Yi, then what is 0100, or 1000 called? But these didn't matter. He just wished to know one thing right now. Why is it Lin Lin? Zhang Chen with a complicated expression asked the question bothering him. Maybe it is the father's guilt to his daughter, or maybe because it's something else? Lin Minji shrugged and said in a nonchalant manner, "The master that created me did not tell me such details. I am afraid I can't answer that question. As for why you should use these clones, I think even if I don't tell you, knowing the time of when this fallout shelter was completed, you should realize the answer." Zhang Chen paused for a second, but soon understood the message behind his words. The Third World War started in 2171. This undocumented fallout shelter was built in 2168. Therefore, as it was built before the start of the war, the world economy was still a mess and the Science Ethics Committee was still in existence. Therefore, it would be impossible to select a group of volunteers willing to go to the future. From this point of view, the choice of using clones to pass on the seeds of civilization seemed like a helpless choice in the context of history. Although it also violated the taboos of science, at least the creation of clones could be carried out in secrecy. However, another question still troubled Zhang Chen. "I don't understand why people must be used as the carrier of information instead of the more efficient machine. A mobile hard disk could carry more information than the human brain, and unlike humans, the machine naturally does not know how to forget. Even after millenniums, as long as the parts themselves are not oxidized, knowledge can be passed on for generations." "You are not the first person to ask this question," my programmer muttered to me before, "but I regret that I can't give you a standard answer." Lin Minji spread his hand. "For reference, I can only tell you the conclusions from the Seeds of Civilization researchers. Hard drives can pass on knowledge, but only people can serve as the embodiment of civilization." After a pause, Lin Minji went on, "Their soul is like a blank sheet of paper. Other than the knowledge they are taught in virtual reality programs, their cognitive and learning abilities are almost the same as those of newborn babies. As long as you are willing to accept them, they will be able to adapt to the outside world in the shortest amount of time. As for whether to accept them, the choice is yours." In an understatement, Lin Minji gave Zhang Chen the toughest decision he has had to make. Zhang Chen silently looked at number 0001 lying in the hibernation chamber, the girl named Lin Yi. Right now, she was expressionless and looking at him with the eyes of a baby. The clothes covering her body had slipped off when she reached out to gently touch the cold barrel around her. She curiously touched its outline, completely oblivious to the lack of clothes on her body. "What is this?" Lin Yi asked. Silence lingered for a long time, before Zhang Chen finally let out a sigh. He put the rifle in his hand down, picked up her clothes, and covered her. "Put on your clothes first." "Clothes?" Lin Yi tilted her head. Zhang Chen's mouth twitched. He now understood the meaning of "their soul is like a blank sheet of paper." Chapter 991 2001 Sister 1. Zhang Chen recalled when he was still in high school and the anime he saw a long time ago. The background was in a city similar to Penglai, except the city was not floating in the sea. A group of students with superpowers lived inside the city. There was an interesting setting that intrigued him. The female protagonist was a clone with superpowers. She was used as cheap weapons for inhumane research purposes. Her cost of production was only 180,000 yen with over 20,000 units produced. Her cost was even lower than sex dolls. Zhang Chen didn't know what the cost of Lin Yi and her sisters were, but it couldn't be cheap. The basic artificial intelligence based on Dr. Lin Minji didn't plan to answer any questions about these clones and East Asia heavy industries. Everything was answered by proprietary secret. After listening to the answer of Lin Minji, Zhang Chen was not pleased. Proprietary secret? Go to hell. East Asia Heavy Industries is probably in some gutter outside of the solar system. However, for a program without the ability to think, there was not much he could do. Threat? Stop joking. Threatening a basic artificial intelligence that doesn't know what is life and death will make people laugh at you. As for hacking the system, NAC possessed a number of computer experts, but for the computer infiltration that lacked practically, Yao Yao was probably one of the best. However, Zhang Chen was very aware that even if Yao Yao's computer skills are great, there would still be a big gap compared with the cybersecurity experts whose jobs depended on this before the war. You don't know how to wear clothes? Separated by the steel gloves, Zhang Chen carefully held the clothes and tried to put it on Lin Yi. However, Lin Yi was not Lin Lin with a titanium alloy skeleton. After he accidentally used too much force, tears began to form in her eyes as she was about to cry in pain. With a sigh, Zhang Chen took off the power armor. He picked up the clothes and put it on Lin Yi. You don't even know how to wear clothes. Forget it. There is no point talking any sense into you. Let's just finish this and go back. Wait, your hands. No touching. It was fine putting clothes on her. If she didn't move around, it was an easy task. But her hands were moving untouching him while he was trying to do this very simple task, as if she just encountered something novel. Zhang Chen was not an expert in taking care of children, not to mention that he could not treat her as a child. The fine skin was like a finely crafted art. With genetic modification, they possessed beauty and body proportion no inferior to Lin Lin. Even Zhang Chen, who encountered many beautiful women, found it difficult to concentrate. Read more chapter on novel full. Finally, he put the one-piece uniform and the white coat on her. He raised his arm and wiped his forehead. Zhang Chen glanced at the more than 2,000 hibernation chambers inside the hall. The idea of 2,000 more giant babies gave him a headache. Lin Minji in the screen looked at him with intrigue, as he interrupted and suggested, "You can let the few people outside help you. At your current speed, I am afraid that you won't be able to put clothes on all of them by tomorrow. I didn't plan to get everyone out today." Zhang Chen looked at the man on the screen. "I need to consult someone before I receive these clones." "Who?" Lin Lin. Lin Minji's expression showed a hint of surprise, but it quickly returned to normal. However, his expression did not escape Zhang Chen's eyes. "You seem to know something about Lin Lin?" Raising an eyebrow, Zhang Chen tightened the zipper for Lin Yi while examining the man on the screen. "Well, I know a little. When I was being programmed, my creator, Dr. Lin Minji, once told me about his daughter." Lin Minji did not conceal anything. After all, this private matter was not classified as proprietary secret. Naturally, he didn't need to keep it confidential. "What did he mention?" Zhang Chen asked. "Mental tree diagrams, collective unconsciousness and unified behavioral models, as well as the principles of brainwave resonance, seem to be related to genetics and brain science." These words made Zhang Chen pause. If his ability to comprehend was fine, the three terms seemed to be from biology, completely unrelated to technology. From Zhang Chen's impression, Dr. Lin Minji should be an expert specialized in electronics and mechanics. He devoted his life to searching for the mean to engrave the consciousness on the circuit board, replacing the flesh and bone with electric current and machinery, and becoming supreme. In order to bring civilization in the supreme direction, he even sacrificed his daughter's happiness. He even sacrificed his own body and sealed his own brain into small culture chamber. The stubborn madman was interested in a field he scorned. Zhang Chen silently recorded these keywords, climbed into the power armor, and picked up Lin Yi. Seeing Zhang Chen was planning to leave, Lin Minji reminded him, fearful that he may have forgotten. "There are still 1999 people in hibernation. I suggest you bring them. I will be back in the next 2 days." Without planning to speak more nonsense with the artificial intelligence, Zhang Chen left the room. Fortunately, Lin Yi could speak. On the way out of the fallout shelter, Zhang Chen told her his name, told her what she needed to pay attention to outside, and specifically mentioned to her not to touch everything out of curiosity. In addition to telling her basic common sense, Zhang Chen also asked her a few questions about herself. Although she lacked common sense, when he mentioned mechanism of deep brainwave action and nonspecific projection system of cortical thalamus, she could easily explain the concept and quickly recite principles. The difference made Zhang Chen question his university degree. His knowledge was inferior to a 3-year-old. Passing through the corridor and back to the elevator, Hu Cheng rushed in his direction as he walked up to the door. For the girl in Zhang Chen's arms, He didn't even look at her. Although he didn't understand the relationship between the girl and the girl in the fishbone base with the same appearance, intuition told him that knowing too much would not be a good idea, so he chose to ignore the topic. "General, are you okay?" For this overprotective knight, Jiang Chen couldn't say anything negative and just smiled. "I'm fine. It's very safe inside. I have a task for you." "On your command." Hu Cheng stood straight. "Take your squad and secure this place. Without my order, no one can pass this door." Jiang Chen pointed to the ground and ordered. Hu Cheng smashed his fist on his chest and saluted. "Roger." Even if the general told him to fight the death claw, he wouldn't even raise an eyebrow. Chapter 992 2001 Sisters 2. Imagine if one day you meet someone on the street who looks exactly like you. Your first reaction is definitely not to go up and shake hands with that person. Of course, it's impossible to encounter this scenario in reality. After all, the law limits the development of cloning technology, and modern society will not permit this type of experiment to be carried out. When Jiang Chen took Lin Yi back to the fishbone base by helicopter, it was already night time. It was inconvenient to arrange accommodations for Lin Yi, and he worried about her safety, so he took her home, and a problem soon ensued. Lin was going to encounter a sister she never met before. "Who is she?" Standing in the living room of the mansion, when Lin saw Lin Yi, her eyebrows raised up in anger and said with vigilance. Lin Yi seemed to be startled by Lin's action as she shrunk back behind Jiang Chen. Jiang Chen expected Lin to react this way. He let out a sigh and put his hand on Lin Yi's head to comfort her, before gently pushing her in front of Lin. "Your sister, somatic cell cloning, should she be considered your sister?" Jiang Chen didn't know how to define the relationship between the mother and the clone, and even this statement ended with uncertainty in his tone. After all, no reference existed for such a case. "I don't remember having a sister." Lin looked at Jiang Chen seriously and had a rare stern expression on her face. Then, she said a word at a time. "Tell me, where did you find this woman?" He felt something weird with this question coming from Lin, but he couldn't explain why. Perhaps they heard the noise downstairs. Sun Jiao and Ziru also came down out of curiosity. When Sun Jiao saw the little girl standing behind Jiang Chen, she was obviously stunned, and then she looked at Lin with a strange expression. "Your long-lost sister?" Different from the reaction of her sister, Ziruo was intrigued by the situation. The pair of beautiful pupils focused on Lin for a while before moving to the little girl hiding behind Jiang Chen. She began to giggle. "Ah. It seems that we have to add a pair of chopsticks at the table?" Lin seemed to be ticked off by this sentence as she became enraged. "Impossible. How could I possibly? How could I live with this person who looks exactly like me? This is too strange. There must be something wrong." "Wait, no electronic eyes. She should not be a digitalized human." "No." Lin jumped beside Lin Yi and ignored the startled eyes. She reached out her devil claws and began to examine the counterfeit all over. But the more she examined, the more she was depressed and sad because of inexplicable jealousy and a mixture of other emotions. "A pair of chopsticks." Jiang Chen's expression became awkward. He didn't tell Lin that at the bottom of Poyang Lake, there were 1,999 more clones still lying in the hibernation chamber, ones who used her as the blueprint. In the living room of the mansion, the head of the family, Jiang Chen, decided to hold the first family meeting in a long time to discuss what to do with Lin Yi. Even Yao Yao attended the meeting in her loose night dress and bunny slippers, overwhelmed with sleepiness. He didn't remember what they discussed about the last time they had a meeting. Those attending held expressions of curiosity, inquiry, anger, or sleepiness. Jiang Chen cleared his throat, cleared his mind, and began to narrate the story, from the conversation with the director of Fallout Shelter 118 to the treasure he opened at the bottom of Poyang Lake. This is what happened. Half an hour passed as Jiang Chen explained what had happened. Jiang Chen looked around at the women with helplessness. "I want to hear your opinions on this little girl." Jiang Chen paused and looked at Lin, who was sitting next to Lin Yi, pouting. "Of course, The most important thing is Lin's opinion. Lin didn't expect Zhang Chen to suddenly put the focus on her. She immediately blushed and became embarrassed. Me? After all, they're your clones. There are still 1,999 more sleeping at the bottom of Poyang Lake cloned from your somatic cells. Zhang Chen looked at Lin Yi, who was sitting in the corner of the living room not far away. You have the power to decide whether to accept her or not. When Lin heard Zhang Chen's words, she lowered her head in distress. What should she do? She was also unsure. Although Lin likes to badmouth people, she has good qualities, and could even be described as kind. Although she couldn't accept the counterfeits cloned through her own DNA, both physically and psychologically, she also couldn't make the cruel decision about their fate. After some internal battles, Lin bit her teeth and finally made up her mind. Accepting them is not impossible. When he heard Lin's words, he let out a sigh of relief and thanked her with a smile. Lin's face turned red and she looked away, whispering, "This is not for you, don't overthink it." 2,000 scientists would be really important to Zhang Chen, but he couldn't completely ignore the feelings of the people around him. Lin accepting them would be the best possible outcome. If not, he wouldn't force her. They could still prove to be valuable if isolated away from others in the bottom of Poyang Lake or Camp 027. However, the efficiency would be lower, and it would remain as something in Lin's mind. Since Lin expressed her willingness to accept the 2,000 cloned sisters, Sun Zhao, Ziru, Yao naturally didn't disagree. Only after solving the big problem of stay or leave, there was still a big issue in front of everyone. The key is, where are they going to live? Sun Ziru's index finger gently touched her lower lip as she said, thoughtfully, if there are only 1 or 2 pairs of chopsticks, it doesn't matter, but 2,000 more pairs of chopsticks. Sun Ziru looked at Zhang Chen with concern and raised a very real problem. Even if our mansion doubles, I am afraid we can't fit so many people. Where are they going to live? This is indeed a problem. It was impossible to put 2,000 Lins inside the mansion, but anywhere else, it would be hard to be reassured. After all, their minds are no different from children. They are not ready to be contact with survivors yet. However, Sun Zhao brought up a good proposal. How about we build a research institute behind the mansion? These 2,000 Lin clones are all scientists in different fields. Living in the institute is probably better than running around outside, Sun Zhao suggested. Chapter 993 The Good Stuff from the Sea. Clones certainly exist on the wasteland, but their presence is not welcomed, especially for the clones produced from the fallout shelters. They served as toys. While the phenomenon changed when Nak took office, but people's natural discrimination against these unnatural-born lives could not simply be changed with a decree. The best-case scenario was to separate Lin's sisters from the survivors and have them taken care of by professional caregivers. Sun Zhao's proposal received unconditional support from Lin. Building a research institute behind the mansion was a compromise. They didn't live too far away, but there was no need to see them every day. Thinking from Lin's perspective, it would be odd if she saw someone who looked exactly like her every day. Zhang Chen didn't think he could stand the idea. In the end, Zhang Chen adopted Sun Zhao's proposal. The next day, he went to the logistics department to see Lu Huaxing. The decision was to remove the old warehouse behind the mansion and build a new semi-enclosed research institute on the existing foundation that accommodates 2,000 people. Immediately afterward, Zhang Chen found Wang Qing and ordered her to recruit a group of trustworthy female employees from the Fishbone Base or the 6th Street. The best candidates would be people born in fallout shelters with experience in nursing or caregiving. Zhang Chen ordered them to be on standby in Hongcheng to take home number 0002 2,000 Lins from fallout shelter T7. Zhang Chen trusted Wang Qing's attention to details. He couldn't follow every step of this task since, after a few days, he must go back to the modern world to Moscow. After repeatedly cautioning her on the important details, Zhang Chen left the community center and headed to Zhonglin's Aerospace Science and Technology Institute. When Zhang Chen arrived at the Aerospace Science and Technology Institute, Zhonglin was out of the office. After speaking with his assistant, he learned that the chief engineer who loved to get hands-on with all projects went to participate in the manufacturing process. I'm going to take a look at the warehouse in a bit. This is a couple of boxes of tea as a gift for him. Zhang Chen handed the bag to his assistant. While these luxuries were easily accessible to Zhang Chen, it was not so easy for the survivors on the wasteland. After all, technology was not the solution to everything, especially the luxury goods cultivated by traditional means. Even before the war, natural and pollution-free goods could not be easily purchased. The assistant quickly took over the bag in Zhang Chen's hand and expressed his gratitude for his boss. It was not because of the value of the goods, but because it was a gift from the general. Sorry for troubling you. Zhang Chen smiled and waved his hand and said with ease, no problem, it's on the way. Since he didn't need anything in life anymore, whenever he saw something interesting in the modern world that he couldn't use, he would purchase the goods and toss them into the storage dimension. Then he would gift them in the apocalypse. While it was a small gesture for him, his subordinates often treated it as a prestigious reward. After leaving the office, Zhang Chen walked to the warehouse behind the Aerospace Science and Technology Institute. Different from Celestial Trade in the modern world, the Aerospace Science and Technology Institute was the research institution with the lowest security in Fishbone Base. It didn't even have a lock on the door and anyone could walk in and out. Although rarely anyone visited this place, the difference made sense. Space technology was probably the least valuable technology on this wasteland. All space technology from the 22nd century onwards was based on the development of space elevators. By the current state, it was impractical to build a space elevator on the wasteland, including the NAC. Most people regarded this institute as a personal hobby of the general, just like the department that specializes in game development. No one really held an optimistic view on the development of space technology. If the chief designer Zhang Lin didn't occasionally participate in the development of kinetic skeleton technology, the institute's presence would be completely non-existent. Zhang Chen was also aware of this issue, but he didn't intervene. After all, the technology from the institute was exported to the modern world and had little practical value in the apocalypse. When Zhang Chen arrived at the warehouse, Zhang Lin with his fellow researchers was busy working in front of a strangely shaped wreck. He also happened to bump into an acquaintance. Wu Yuzheng from the Beluga observation station was standing next to Zhang Lin. He curiously looking at the researchers working on the wreckage with instruments. Because he had nothing to do, he immediately noticed Zhang Chen's arrival. Hey, what brought you here? Wu Yu's eyes lit up and immediately greeted him with a warm smile. Zhang Chen gestured for Zhang Lin to continue with their work before he started to chat with Wu Yu. I wanted to ask you the same thing. Why are you not at the 6th Street waiting for business? Haha, it is the beginning of the spring. The merchants are all rushing to the hinterland. It is the low season for those of us escorting on the ocean. When all the merchants make enough money and it becomes closer to winter, they will consider going to Japan, Korea, or even further. Wu Yu laughed, then patted the wreckage that resembled some kind of aircraft. Since I have nothing to do, I brought this thing we found when we were cruising in the Western Pacific. I thought you'd be interested, so I brought it here. Zhang Lin tossed down the tools in his hands, wiped the sweat on his forehead, and walked toward Zhang Chen. The Soaring 07 engine, the product of Pan Asia Space Group. From the debris on the interface, it should be on the SSC Dragon. If I remember correctly, SSC Dragon was a transport ship to Mars. You guys are too lucky to have found this. Have you seen it before? Wu Yu raised an eyebrow and looked at Zhang Lin with interest. Because of work needs, the two were often in contact with each other and knew some of each other's backgrounds. For example, Wu Yu knew Zhang Lin was a native of the wasteland, born in the years after the war. I have seen it in videos before. Zhang Lin shrugged. This engine, is it used for transportation to Mars? Zhang Chen walked closer to the engine, intrigued by the wreckage. He knocked on the titanium alloy casing. Celestial Trade was troubled on how to design a spaceship that can travel to Mars, and Wu Yu brought him a big gift. It's a destroyed engine, Zhang Lin emphasized. There is no problem in restoring the technology in this wreckage, but building a spacecraft capable of traveling beyond the moon is not as easy as having an engine. It was great to be able to restore the technology. At least now they have a reference on how to build a long-distance transport engine. With this engine, they should be able to design a space colonization ship capable of reaching Mars before the end of 2019. Give me a price. Zhang Chen looked at Wu Yu. Same old. We will charge a salvage fee, 20,000 credit points. Wu Yu smiled. Done. Zhang Chen took out a graphene card from his pocket and brushed it against Wu Yu's EP. The 20,000 credits were directly sent to the Beluga Observation Station bank account registered by NAC. Looking at the number jumping in the EP, Wu Yu was so happy he couldn't close his mouth. 20,000 credit points was a generous foreign exchange income for Beluga Observation Station. The 6th Street products were in high demand in Beluga Observation Station, especially the canned beef and canned pork. These couldn't be grown in the submarine farms. As for steel, aluminum, and even rare earth materials, those were even in higher demand as he must purchase a large number of shipments every quarter. And that was Zhang Chen's goal. He was not afraid of the Beluga Observation Station making money off of him. Only by making money would they try their best to salvage parts for him. These things offered no value other than scrap metal, but in his hands, no amount of canned food and instant noodles could equate to their value. Chapter 994 Consciousness Communication. After receiving the payment, Wu Yu did not stay for long. He had some small talks with Zhang Chen for a bit longer before departing. After Wu Yu left, Zhang Chen asked Zhang Lin to store the engine first. The institute would start the reverse engineering process to create the blueprint, then send the prototype with the blueprint to the warehouse in his backyard. After these instructions, he pulled Zhang Lin aside and handed him a folded blueprint. The main purpose of his visit to the Aerospace Science and Technology Institute was not to examine the engine, but to design a piece of technology, or a weapon for him. After taking the drawings from Zhang Chen's hands, Zhang Lin frowned. He tilted his neck and put his hand on his chin but couldn't come up with a conclusion after a long examination. Because of the lack of reaction, Zhang Chen spoke out. What do you think? Are you confident? Of course. Shanghai is full of this stuff everywhere, especially the closer we get to the city center. Zhang Lin returned the sketch to Zhang Chen and asked the question bothering him. But what's the purpose of this? Zhang Chen slapped his head and forgot about this. Those steel prisms stuck in the concrete are NATO orbital airborne pods? He didn't need to use models built in a game. Yes. The prismatic steel box in the sketch is the descending objects used for his space defense force. Based on his concept, using these steel boxes can allow his soldiers to be deployed to anywhere on the surface from the synchronous orbit within any location on Earth. Don't worry about the use, there is, of course, a purpose. Zhang Chen, using his usual tactic, avoided the question. Zhang Lin naturally didn't persist on the question simply for the sake of curiosity. With a nod, he took the errand. He said that the prototype and drawings could be completely in half a month at the latest. As for the sketch, Zhang Chen crumbled it and tossed it into the trash. With a ready-made model to reference from, it was not necessary to design based on the sketch. They could easily take a few of those pods from the city center and reverse engineer the design. After leaving the Aerospace Science and Technology Institute, Zhang Chen toured around the Fishbone base. Almost 4 years passed, and the base received a new look every year. He couldn't even recognize some places anymore. The wall drenched by mutants' blood was removed and placed 2 blocks out. A dozen more kilometers out was the 6th Street. The underground sewage system that connected Fishbone and 6th Street were even upgraded to a maglev track, based on Chunan's plan. Once the Holy Shield system is fixed, the 6th Street and the Fishbone base could merge into one after a few more years of development. Based on his words, the quality of the houses on the outskirts of Shanghai was still good. It would be a pity to let them go to waste. Since the mutants and zombies were eradicated, it was more cost-effective to reuse than to rebuild them. While walking, Zhang Chen's thoughts drifted elsewhere, thinking about what was missing from the base. What is missing? It seems that nothing is missing. The second and third Garden of Edens were entering production. Not only vegetables and fruits were being produced, but clone pigs, cows, and sheep were also being bred. Together with canned sugar and mud crabs imported from Yizhou, food was no longer a rarity in Huanghai. Even the poorest citizen could afford meat every week. For this very reason, his personal prestige reached an astounding height. On the wasteland, the person who can make everyone feel safe, feel full, and feel warm, the person will be well deserved of being called the savior. It is no exaggeration to say that even without things like citizen ranking, knight medal and honor collar, no one would rise against him. When Jiang Chen strolled back to his home, he still couldn't think of what was missing in the base. While pleased with the work of his subordinates, he felt somewhat lonely. He was more than happy to give autonomy to his subordinates, but now that they have all matured, he realized that he was no longer helpful. Shaking his head with a smile, Jiang Chen threw these thoughts out of his mind and pushed open the door. He would be crazy to worry about positive changes for the base. The next day, the engineering team began the construction of the research institute. The foundation was already in place and the building didn't need to be high. With the construction speed of the Fishbone engineering team, it would at most take 2 weeks to complete. Jiang Chen spent his time walking around and increasing his presence in the base. At night, he fed the 2 kittens and indulged in the gentleness of the sisters. Time passed quickly and in a blink of an eye, half a week passed. As the artificial intelligence said, Lin Yi's learning ability was impeccable. In just a few days, she learned how to wear clothes, eat, go to the bathroom and take a shower. She even learned some common sense like drying her hair before going to sleep. The artificial intelligence was not accurate about a point, that is, she actually knew these things, like clothes, chopsticks, towels, since she knew what they are called. Of course, she knew their purpose. However, these bits of knowledge were stored in her mind and not habits. After all, from the embryo to her complete form only took up to 2 or 3 weeks. Jiang Chen even suspected that she didn't even live a normal life for a few days before being placed in the hibernation chamber. She must immediately start learning in deep sleep. On the other hand, Lin Lin's attitude also changed a lot. From the initial exclusion to alienation, she now grew closer to her sister. Although the 2 sisters looked identical, they could easily be distinguished. For example, Lin, who is a digitalized human, has a black and red pupil, pale skin, and fairy-like silver hair. Lin Yi's hair was black. Although her skin was pale, it was more similar to Asian skin tones and not as exaggerated as Lin. In order to make the difference more obvious, Lin also demanded Lin Yi to not keep the same hairstyle as her and to not wear the same clothes. Although they didn't have the same clothes to begin with, the strange thing was that Lin Yi, other than Jiang Chen who she encountered first, listened to Lin the most. While she didn't follow every command of Lin, she followed most of them. She followed Lin every day like a pet. So one day, she also discovered a special function, the ability to communicate with Lin Yi through consciousness. It was a mysterious feeling, even Lin didn't understand it. 2 people didn't even speak, didn't even look at each other, and didn't even need to be in the same room, but after they entered a certain state, they can understand each other's thoughts. The state was quite stable. Lin didn't understand the mechanism behind the state and even made a fool of herself quite a few times. Jiang Chen and Lin herself didn't know if this was positive or negative. They also didn't know what will happen after the rest of the 1999 sisters wake up. But in any case, it was an incredible discovery. Chapter 995 The Intimacy Before Parting. After a few days of pondering, Lin was still confused about the connection between her and Lin Yi. In her words, it seemed that there was an invisible cord between their brains. When a voice called her, if she responded, she could sense the connection with Lin Yi. The connection was mysterious. Not only were thoughts shared, but even things that were difficult to describe, such as thinking, knowledge, and experience could be shared through this connection. In a nutshell, it was like 2 servers connected in parallel. Because the digitalized human possessed computation power comparable to the quantum computer, Lin Lin would be the host. Lin Yi held the knowledge of mechanism of deep brainwave action and non-specific projection system of cortical thalamus. Although this knowledge was outside of Lin Lin's field of research, Lin Lin could burrow this knowledge stored in Lin Yi, like burrowing a hard drive, via this connection. It was hard to describe the feeling. Jiang Chen thought about it himself. If Lin Lin and her 2,000 sisters were put together, it was similar to forming a large integrated chip supercomputer with biological kernel. Lin Lin did not deny this statement, but neither did she agree. She was uncertain herself if it worked the same way on 2,000 people as on one person. After all, before the war, cloning was the taboo of science. Even if someone conducted experiments in secrecy, the state-level secret would not be accessible by everyone. There was no precedent or reference for them to consult. Now that the institute was still in the process of construction, Lin Lin's sisters didn't have a place to stay, so they still remained inside the hibernation chambers and were looked after by professional caregivers. But before they moved in, Jiang Chen did a lot of experiments. For example, the sensing distance between the two. Jiang Chen tried to let Lin Lin and Lin Yi stand at the two ends of the fishbone base and attempt to sense the connection with a distance of more than 10 kilometers. Lin Lin and Jiang Chen were both surprised that the connection still could exist, even if the connection was weakened by the increase in distance. Shocked by the magical telepathy, Jiang Chen was also wondering if it is a technology created by East Asia Heavy Industries. After all, he did hear novel terms like mental tree diagram from that artificial intelligence. Jiang Chen not for a second believed that they were a proper corporation. Applying the logic of the modern world, Dr. Lin Minji was just a poor scholar that owed an astronomical amount of debt. Even if a paper of his was published by the Science Ethics Committee and attracted the attention of big companies, it just doesn't make sense for him to receive such a high budget. Money doesn't grow on trees, even for megacorporations. Jiang Chen reflected on this and thought he gave a generous amount of funding to his scientists, but he couldn't just let them freely spend it. Every project must go through the approval process, and it's detailed enough that he knows where every single dollar is spent. He just couldn't fathom the idea of using the budget to build a fallout shelter to work toward the glorious destination of Supreme. In the end, even using the cells of his daughter to clone 2,000 copies to send them to the future. As long as the management of East Asia Heavy Industries were not stupid, there was only one possibility. Dr. Lin Minji was just one of their pawns, and this company couldn't just be a company. The ability to dig a hole inside the economic center of Pan-Asia cooperation and leave their iron seals on countless air defense projects in that special era demonstrated political influence and power. However, Jiang Chen still couldn't comprehend one thing. These officials and business people all left Earth on the space colonization ship Zheng. By the time they woke up from the hibernation chambers 500 years later, they would be at a picturesque new world. What would be left on this crumbling planet to long after? Jiang Chen shook his head and left the matter behind him. He would have too much time on his hand to worry about a company from before the war. If he was really curious, he could ask Han Junhua, DSI. Speaking of her, since that time on the airship, she hasn't treated him emotionlessly for a long time. The metal commissioner was certainly tough, but not strong enough to withstand the improved slavery chip created by the slave masters of the wasteland. Though the soul is tough, it can't stand the slavery chip from the wasteland. With a press of the bottom, he could make her feel whatever emotion he wished. Ahem, I have to go back tomorrow. Jiang Chen gently kissed Sun Zhao's lips and collapsed beside her. He didn't even have the strength to wipe the sweat off of his forehead. Next to her, her sister Ziru shrunk into a ball. Her messy hair was spread freely on the bed as she was already asleep. This girl teased him during the day, but Jiang Chen and Sun Zhao worked together too, shouting sister, brother-in-law to the point where she was losing her voice. Because of this punishment, Jiang Chen was completely exhausted. Only Sun Zhao with insane body attributes and her sister with matching stats could tire him out. Can't you go back just a few days later? Sun Zhao pouted, turned over and whispered in Jiang Chen's ear. She was just like a cat seeking for attention as she nibbled on his ear. I also want to stay here all the time. Zhang Chen closed his eyes. It's so relaxing here. He was being truthful. He originally planned to be a wealthy man in the modern world, but ambition grew. Once it swelled to the point where he couldn't control it anymore, he lost his opportunity to just be ordinary. When he learned that a space colonization ship was on its way to his hometown, he had to do something. "You are just sweet-talking me." Sun Jiao was still pouting. She obviously did not believe Zhang Chen's rhetoric. Who would choose to live a difficult life? She told Zhang Chen more than once that when Lin Lin invents the ability to travel to the modern world, the first thing she will do is resign as the wife of the general. She will leave this wasteland to enjoy the life of the 21st century. She was not interested in caring about the daily lives of the survivors. If she could, neighborhood, why be a king in the slums? If it was not to help Zhang Chen and she happened to be free, she wouldn't have collected so much burden for herself. Whenever she thought about Zhang Chen leaving her to enjoy the life in the modern world, then tease her constantly with videos and photos, Sun Jiao gritted her teeth and took a bite of Zhang Chen's shoulder before sitting on top of Zhang Chen again. "Hey, are you a dog? Wait, what are you doing?" "I am not full yet." Sun Jiao's eyes narrowed. With a smirk, she put her finger under Zhang Chen's chin. The same sadist vibe used on her sister once again appeared. "Don't move." "Wait, my resilience is not as strong as you. Can we continue tomorrow?" "It's already past 12, I need to sleep." Looking at the smirking face approaching him, Zhang Chen didn't know if he should laugh or cry. The resilience buff meant that even 10 Zhang Chen could not match Sun Jiao, especially since he had already emptied his load when he was punishing Ziru. His legs were already shaking. "That is not up to you." The watery pupils turned around, and Ziru, who woke up, was looking curiously in their direction. There was not a trace of tiredness on her face. "Ziru, help me pin him down." "Okay, sister." Sun Ziru smiled and hugged Zhang Chen from behind. She used her arms to hook onto his arms. With eyes that spoke, she looked at Zhang Chen through the reflection in the mirror. "Brother-in-law, don't move." The back of his head rested on two firm gentlenesses. Even if he wanted to resist, he didn't have the energy anymore. He could only watch the smirking Sun Jiao move closer and closer to him. Chapter 996. Returning to the modern world. Zhang Chen sometimes felt that the way Sun Jiao smirked really resembled him. No, to be precise, the sadist side that he occasionally would reveal probably came from her. Looking at the peaceful face, Zhang Chen leaned down slightly and left a kiss on her forehead. After a night of rest, he regained most of his energy. To avoid disturbing the two women, Zhang Chen gently quietly moved off of the bed. But as soon as his center of gravity left the bed, his legs couldn't help but tremble and he almost fell down face first. He turned around and was about to glare at Sun Jiao. However, when he saw the joyous face deep in sleep, he suddenly lost his temper. He gritted his teeth and limped toward the door. Because of the side effects of the inhibitor plus mild anemia, Yao Yao usually had a difficult time getting up in the morning. Ziru was responsible for breakfast on weekdays. Now that Ziru was still recovering and Sun Jiao was sleeping in it would be hysterical to count on Lin Lin. The burden naturally fell on the head of the family. Although Lin Lin was never interested in cooking, she never compromised on food. She washed up quickly and sat at the table, waiting for breakfast to arrive. Zhang Chen was planning to send her directly to the cafeteria in the community center to take care of breakfast, but now with Lin Yi who shouldn't be walking around, he had to cook for the first time in a long time. He made breakfast while yawning profusely before finally walking out with fried eggs sizzling with oil. As for milk and bread, Lin Lin understood how to use the microwave, and they were already on the table. "By the way, you are walking. Are you okay?" Looking at Zhang Chen limping with the plates toward the table, Lin Lin looked at him strangely. "I fell down going down the stairs." "That's a lie. When I went to the washroom last night, I saw Sister Ziru sneak into your room. You must have done something bad to become like this morning." Lin Lin's unrelenting words came out while chewing on the egg sandwich. "Not your issue." Zhang Chen shot Lin Lin a look. "Humphrey." After swallowing the food in her mouth, Lin Lin spat out her tongue and pouted. Lin Yi tilted her head. and the hands holding the sandwich stopped in front of her mouth. She was using her innocent eyes to examine the two. Also, isn't there a washroom on the first floor? Why did you have to go to the washroom on the second floor? Suddenly realizing another problem, Zhang Chen added, Not your issue. Lin Lin's face turned red, her voice quieted down, and she couldn't come up with an answer. In the end, she pretended not to hear the question and no longer spoke. She didn't know why. The washroom on the first floor was closer, but she couldn't stop herself from going to the one on the second floor every night. Seeing the quiet Lin was very rare, Zhang Chen also stopped battering with her and focused on enjoying his own gourmet meal. After finishing breakfast, Zhang Chen went to the kitchen again and stuffed some more mango pudding into the fridge. After he was done, he told Lin, I put some more pudding in the fridge, don't eat it all at once. Lin buried her head and whispered. Zhang Chen glanced at Lin strangely. He couldn't understand what happened to her today. Normally, she would jump up in happiness hearing that the fridge is stuffed with puddings. This unusually quiet state was not like her. While perplexed, Zhang Chen didn't think too much of it. Even the liveliest people would experience a few down days. After breakfast, he went to the bathroom, brushed his teeth and washed his face, and then took a shower. He had recovered by this point. At least he was no longer shaking, and his back was no longer so sore. It was about time to go back, so he went to Yao Yao's room. It was only 8 in the morning, so Yao Yao naturally was still asleep. The little girl did not have the habit of locking her door. Zhang Chen just gently pushed it open and walked into Yao Yao's boudoir. A faint fragrance blew in his face, following the unique fragrance belonging to Yao Yao. Zhang Chen quietly walked to her bed without disturbing this peace. He examined the cute face under the ray of morning light and a heartfelt smile appeared on his face. It seemed like she was dreaming of something delicious. The slightly open lips formed a happy arc. A sparkling silver thread hung at the corner of her mouth, just like morning dew on the mimosa. Delicate and cute. Zhang Chen did not wake Yao Yao. He leaned down and kissed her, counting it as a simple farewell. After he left the room, he gently closed the door behind him. When Zhang Chen opened his eyes from the soft bed, he saw the sea breeze blowing in the open window. He could hear the rustling sand mixed with the sea wave. After he slowly adjusted his mindset back to the 21st century, he got out of bed. The room was quiet. Aisha had already left for Moscow, and Zayasha had gone to the future building. He was the only person in the mansion. After returning to the modern world, Zhang Chen didn't just sit around. He immediately began to pack his luggage for Russia. Although Natasha said that he can go live at her place, considering that he may be in a foreign country for 2 to 3 weeks, he still must prepare some necessary items, whether in his luggage or in the storage dimension. After Zhang Chen finished packing, it was already noon. While humming a song, he was preparing to treat himself to some fine dishes and a couple of good wines, but when he opened the fridge, he was suddenly speechless. There was only half a pizza, a box of unopened pasta, and also a bottle of champagne, but it wouldn't taste the same without an accompanying dish. Clearly, no one has cooked in this house for a while. It was understandable for this to happen. Aisha, the cook, went to Moscow and Zhang Chen also spent some time in the apocalypse. In the past week or so, Zayasha was alone in this mansion. Since she could eat 2 of her meals at the future building cafeteria, even if she knows how to cook, she must have been too lazy to cook alone. Why is this girl so lazy? Closing the fridge door, Zhang Chen muttered to himself. Although he could ring someone and they would deliver the ingredients to him, it would still take 2 hours. By then, it would be time for his afternoon nap. With that thought in mind, Zhang Chen left the kitchen depressed and went back to the garage. Since there was no food at home, he had to go to the future building. Chapter 997 A pleasant but short lunch break. When Zhang Chen walked into the future building, it was lunch break. The building was filled with people moving between places as they chatted with their coworkers. Fortunately for Zhang Chen, he came early. If it was just a little bit later, he would be stuck waiting for an elevator. However, it was a smooth ride up for him. Most of the employees recognized his face. If he squeezed by the elevator, people would let him go up first. When he came to the Western restaurant on the top floor, Jiang Chen followed the window and saw Zayasha sitting by the window. Regardless if he was at the office or not, this spot was exclusive, reserved for him, and the spot across naturally belonged to CEO Zaya. Jiang Chen ordered a beef cheese risotto and a vanilla ice cream. Then he took the plates and walked over to his spot. Seeing someone sit across from her, Zayasha raised her head slightly. When she saw the person in front of her, her eyes burst into color. But then she noticed that she was still at the company and her expression quickly resumed to her serious and reserved state. "Did you miss me?" Jiang Chen raised his eyebrow and looked at her. The long, black hair was tied behind her head, the black frame glasses rested nicely on her pretty nose, her skin was as pristine as new snow, and the clean and elegant black professional dress didn't hide her beauty but amplified her innate standoffish temperament. He must admit that watching a beauty eat is both a spiritual and physiological enjoyment. The two fingers holding on to the silver fork, gracefully sending vegetables covered in salad dressing into her red mouth. Her lips were moistened by the tomato juice, and white salad dressing covering the corner of her mouth made him begin to fantasize. Biting a small tomato, Zayasha continued to maintain her cold appearance and made a sound with her nose. "Humphrey, what's the use of missing you? You don't come back anyway." "I'm back now." Jiang Chen, with thick skin, smiled. He put his hand on his chin and examined her for a long time. When Zayasha began to blush, he stopped harassing her with his eyes and said seriously, "You became even prettier in just 1 week." Her cheeks were covered by a red hue, and she rolled her eyes before continuing to enjoy the tomato in her salad. Although she didn't say anything, the love flowing out of her watery eyes vividly rendered her thoughts and longing for him. Jiang Chen couldn't resist anymore and hurriedly finished his lunch. When Zayasha was about to go back to the office, he stopped her at his door. Perhaps he missed her too dearly as everything came so naturally. Jiang Chen closed the door behind him and pushed her against the door. Without saying anything, he kissed her seductive lips. The beauty between his arms only resisted for a moment before Jiang Chen felt the hands pushing against his chest slid behind his back. They were no longer pushing him away but turned into an affectionate hug. Jiang Chen was being naughty when they kissed. Not only was he searching for her slippery tongue, but the hands behind her back was also searching. He even unclasped the hook inside her clothes. Her lingerie slipped down, and her body shivered for a moment. She wanted to hide, but her back was already against the door. Even if she could hide, Jiang Chen wouldn't let go of this little lamb. Normally, Zayasha would say pervert, but now her mouth was covered. She could only make sounds and it was impossible to distinguish her words. Seeing the ineffectiveness of her resistance, Zayasha, who has always adhered to her principles, also softened. She half-willingly accepted Jiang Chen doing inappropriate things in the sacred office. Then he even carried her to the office chair next to the floor-to-ceiling window. At the floor-to-ceiling windows, it looked dark inside from the outside, but from the inside, it looked crystal clear. They could even see the vehicles moving on the road and the clouds floating not so far away. It was as exciting as it could be to do naughty things here. After nearly an hour passed and lunch break was almost over, Jiang Chen finally spared the exhausted Zayasha. Although she was injected with the genetic vaccine, she had always lived in a peaceful environment. Her stamina was not comparable to Jiang Chen, who had been on the battlefield before. If Jiang Chen didn't consider that she still had work to do in the afternoon, her legs would probably be trembling. "Now do you believe I missed you?" Fingers gently rubbing on Zayasha's chin, Jiang Chen smiled and looked at Zayasha. She was facing him and sitting on his lap, due to the center of gravity being behind her. Her legs curled slightly back, her back was against the desk and her elbows were even on top of a few documents. She was breathing heavily. Zayasha has a thin face compared to Jiang Chen. Her cheeks were so red that they are bleeding, and the redness even migrated to her neck. She gritted her teeth and punched him in the chest, but because her center of gravity was behind her, she quickly had to stop the punch to balance herself. "Pervert. What if someone hears us? Who dares?" Zhang Chen raised an eyebrow and snarled in a half-joking tone, "I will fire them." No one could hear them as Zhang Chen already had scandalous thoughts when they began the construction of the building. His office's sound insulation was designed according to state-of-the-art sound insulation technology. Even if someone pressed their ear against the door, it would be impossible to hear a sound. But then again, who was bold enough to put an ear on the door of the president's office? Fortunately, your office is on the top floor, or you will have to fire the whole company. Zayasha mocked. Zhang Chen smiled cheekily and avoided answering the question. You must be tired. Let's change positions. Before Zayasha could respond, Zhang Chen used his arms and carried her between his arms. Just then, Zhang Chen noticed that the feet wrapped in black stockings was missing a high heel. Should I help you pick up your shoe? Zayasha held on to Zhang Chen and pressed her burning face against his shoulder to hide her embarrassment. But as the longer she held on to him, the shameful emotion disappeared, and her breathing also calmed down. Perhaps the standoffish mask was worn for too long. She loved the feeling of being between the arms of her loved one. Zhang Chen, who wanted to tease her, swallowed his words and just quietly hugged her, without the need to think about anything. She was being held quietly because it was so comfortable. Soon her breathing turned rhythmic and she fell asleep. Chapter 998 Hua Electricity Group. Happy times are always short-lived. At the end of the lunch break, Zayasha first opened the door of the office to peek outside. From the tiny gap, she observed the situation in the corridor. After confirming that there was no one in the hallway, Zayasha flashed out of the door and fled back to her office. Seeing no one found her abnormality, Zayasha had a sigh of relief behind the door. She sat back at her desk, took out her mirror, fixed her bang, and carefully checked whether her appearance looked odd. Although she already checked once in Zhang Chen's office, it is never a bad idea to check again. However, what Zayasha didn't know was that what happened during lunch break is obvious to anyone with some experience. For example, the young assistant who makes tea and sorts documents every day. Although she just graduated not long ago, she knew exactly what happened during lunch break with just a glance. Some things can't be hidden, such as the hue of her neck and her cheeks, and the fact that she was intermittently blanking out. While making Zayasha coffee, the little girl also estimated that CEO Zai at least climaxed twice in the span of that hour. It was only a thought in her mind, as she would never dare to let this slip out. But with how satisfied CEO Zai looked, the little girl also began to fantasize. When she returned to her desk, she was sorting out the documents while daydreaming. If she was in the president's office, would she resist or be obedient? After Zayasha left, Zhang Chen sprayed air freshener throughout the office, then cleaned up the scattered documents that fell off the table. Zayasha was going to help him clean up, but Zhang Chen declined her kind offer. It was best for her to go back to her office before people returned to work. While very few employees worked on the top floor, other than the assistants, most of them were executives of the group. If people accidentally saw her sneaking out, it would be damaging to her prestige. In the afternoon, Zhang Chen met with the president of Hua Electricity Group. Haha, I have long heard of Mr. Jiang's name. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Jia Zhengerong. This time I represent Hua Electricity Group. I would like to make an inquiry about nuclear fusion power generation. When the 50-year-old man saw Zhang Chen, although he was much older than Zhang Chen, he did not act entitled. He not only smiled and greeted him but also was the first one to extend his hand. His flattering words even made Zhang Chen smile. From the changing attitude of these state-owned enterprise bosses, Zhang Chen began to feel the growing international status of celestial trade. However, a few flattering words wouldn't sway the negotiation. These officials are experienced in the political world. While they may not have good technical understanding, they certainly know how to use the right rhetoric at the right time, so conversation was their strong suit. For the compliments of Mr. Jia Zhengerong, Zhang Chen only smiled and did not let it get to his head. Australia and Malaysia took the lead in completing the submarine cables. At the beginning of this month, The grids were connected. The electricity prices of both countries were reduced by half and they were gradually becoming cheaper. Countries that previously held a speculative view suddenly couldn't wait anymore. Nippon was the first to react. Before the pressured the Nippon authorities to obstruct the construction of the Sumitomo Group so that the project that was originally planned for completion at the beginning of this month had yet to start. Now that they saw results in Australia and Malaysia, the Prime Minister with a reserved attitude immediately took a proactive stance. He no longer cared about the external pressures and brought the construction of the submarine cable onto the country's agenda. Even India, still being delayed in the Malacca Trench, began tossing down cables into the water furiously. They did everything they could to move cheap electricity from Xin at an earlier date to ease the dependence of its energy gap on fossil fuel imports. As Jiang Chen expected, Hua finally couldn't sit still any longer and sent Hua Electricity Group to negotiate. The domestic electricity price averaged about 0.10 XND, and the export price of celestial trade was around 0.010.02 XND. While the difference of 8 Chinese fens may be small, the effect is magnified on an industrial scale. Taking electric steelmaking as an example, a kilowatt of electricity produces around 1.5 kilograms of steel. The 1.5 kilogram of steel, regardless of financial subsidies and steelmaking technology, has a cost of 0.08 XND higher due to electricity costs. In the market, other people's 1.5 kilograms of steel will be 0.08 XND more competitive. How about 1.5 tons? How about 15 million tons? With the amplification of volume, the advantage of cost competitiveness would also become more and more obvious. Sometimes it is about wanting to change, but external pressures could also force people to adapt to the changing era. As one of the world's largest electricity consumption country, Jiang Chen, of course, welcomed Hua Electricity Group to discuss with him about the submarine cable. It was unnecessary to discuss a joint venture for a nuclear fusion power station. Jiang Chen clearly stated that there are no plans to build any nuclear fusion power stations on the surface. Jia Zhengerong was not surprised by his rejection. Then the two sides began to discuss the submarine cable and the power export price. Jiang Chen directly took out the contracts with other countries to discuss cooperation work with Jia Zhengerong. In the end, the two people happily reached a preliminary agreement. The two sides would jointly fund the construction of submarine transmission cables, and Celestial Trade would directly export the electricity to Hua Electricity Group. As for discussion beyond Hua Electricity Group to local companies, it was not something Jiang Chen needed to worry about. As for the amount of capital invested by both sides, who would maintain the cable and how much electricity would be imported in 1 year, those details wouldn't be determined until further discussions. Jiang Chen left the rest of the negotiation work to Ziyashu as he must go on a trip tomorrow and he couldn't make Mr. Jia wait for him. Allow me to ask, is Mr. Jiang planning to go to Moscow in 2 days? Jia Zhengerong smiled and asked, I hope Mr. Jiang doesn't misunderstand. I'm only worried about this contract. Yes, but rest assured, CEO Zia will take care of the rest. Although he didn't openly market his visit, his trip to Russia was no longer a secret. But what made him unsure was whether this question was from him, or from someone else. After hearing Jiang Chen's answer, Jia Zhengerong smiled and gestured. Then I won't bother you any longer. When Mr. Jiang comes to Shangjing, please be sure to let me know. I will definitely do my deed of being a good host. Haha. Then I will certainly let Mr. Jia know. Jiang Chen ceremonially replied, smiled at him, and watched Jia Zhengerong leave his office. Chapter 999 Sharing is Caring. The cooperation with Hua Power Group was an important part of the global power grid plan. Jiang Chen was not afraid that Jia Zhengerong only purchased a limited quantity. He was afraid that he couldn't commit to buying. It was difficult to believe that the government would push for zero emission for thermal power when the cost of electricity was a few cents. You think thermal power's pollution is too high? You need to add a filter at the end of the chimney. Perfect. We think the cost of thermal power is too high. Importing oil to generate electricity is not importing. Isn't it better to buy it directly? When this transmission line is signed, you don't have to worry about energy subsidies. The power station can be directly shut down and a large amount of money can be saved. With this spare cash, it was better to send more benefits to employees, organize study abroad trips and upgrade the vehicles of the leaders. This is a good thing for the benefit of the country and its people. After the letter of intent was signed, Jia Zhengerong paid extra attention to this submarine transmission line. First, he headed on to the sea to inspect the transmission and distribution station, and then he took the initiative to discuss the project with Celestial Trade. Zhang Chen thought it was a done deal, so he entrusted the rest to Xiashu. Zhang Chen was ready to make the appropriate concessions on the transmission line. In the first year, the goal was to increase the amount of power imported by Hua. Last year, Hua's national power generation exceeded more than 6 trillion kWh. This market was bigger than all the countries that Zhang Chen had personally visited combined, and he must focus on this market. The matter of global power grid aside, recently, during the time Zhang Chen was in the apocalypse, a major event happened in the modern world. With the cooperation of the Xin Space Administration, Celestial Trade promulgated the 2019 Celestial Trade Outer Space Resource Development Plan, which aggressively and decisively listed a total of 9 asteroids in the Earth-Moon system for mining purposes. No one doubted the fact whether Celestial Trade will succeed or not. After all, the Bennu asteroid proved their strength. The size of the 9 asteroids are smaller than that of Bennu, and the mineral reserves are unknown. Maybe there are only stones on it, but maybe there are tons of diamonds 100 times bigger than the Cullinan. 1. Developing the universe will always be a gamble. What matters the most is not what is on the asteroid, but the fact that Celestial Trade already possesses the ability to develop space resources on a large scale. However, this also creates a problem. Although there are many asteroids in space, there are also mining challenges to solve. When NASA became involved, it was not happy at all. Although the outer space resources belong to all of mankind, the default rule is it belonged to whoever got to it first. However, if Celestial Trade planned the few asteroids that are the easiest to mine, how are we going to compete? You can be ahead of everyone, but it's not right to not get everyone involved. While unwilling, no one directly opposed this. Why? It's not because of the face of Xin, but because Celestial Trade also added a timely announcement of a plan to explain the previously published 2019 Celestial Trade Outer Space Resource Development Plan. Celestial Trade is willing to contract all 9 asteroids out. Without mining spacecraft, it doesn't matter. Celestial Trade can lend it to you. No transport ships. It doesn't matter. Don't borrow it. Celestial Trade will sell it to you directly. As long as the minimum output value specified in the contract is mined within the contractual deadline, the asteroid's contractual right is still yours. If you don't produce, there are still many people waiting to do it. On the surface, Celestial Trade contracted the 9 asteroids seemed to be a move to divert pressure and give up part of the profits. However, thinking about it carefully, Zhang Chen is simply a bad man. It is best not to monopolize the market. No one will blame you for building a bridge and charging a toll, but if you don't allow anyone to cross the bridge, you will be hated. However, Zhang Chen is not happy to just charge a toll. He wants people who cross the bridge to work for him. Let's not talk about whether these asteroids are filled with gold or slag. Even if you mine the asteroid, you can't throw them directly into the atmosphere. Without a space elevator, the product must be shipped to Celestial City. This is not the end of it. Directly transporting the mine and the rocks back to the surface is simply not worth it. Transported by Celestial Trade, it is best to process it on Celestial City. Iron ore is refined into steel, and titanium ore is refined into titanium ingots. They are not scamming you, as you can process these things in your space station or future mining space station since they are all connected to Celestial Trade. But after all, since it is in the territory of Xin, it is not too much to charge a transaction tax, right? Settled in US dollars? Sorry, The law already stipulates that only one currency is recognized in Celestial City, and that is the Xin New Dollar. The ingots that you produce, whether you send them to the surface and sell them to the international market or sell them directly to the local factory in Celestial City, no one will intervene. The export of mineral ingots is the same as the export of ore. There is no need to pay export tax. At most, a space elevator transportation fee is charged, and port management and usage fee are also charged on the surface. After several taxes and charges, all that money will basically enter the pockets of Celestial Trade. The cost of these ingots is still lower than the average price of the international market. These have nothing to do with the relationship between supply and demand. It is purely because the quality of space ore is too high, and the impurity composition is relatively low. With Celestial Trade's mining and transportation equipment, the cost is extremely low. You don't have to worry about environmental protection, and you don't have to pay a series of additional taxes such as mining tax, education, and urban construction. The asteroids in outer space don't have local governments associated with them. It belongs to whoever mines it. Although they have to pay various fees to Celestial Trade, you are still saving in the end. Celestial Trade is not monopolizing the market, but you have to give us some of the profit. As for renting equipment and selling transport ships, Zhang Chen had other plans. You want my technology? Easy. I will sell it directly to you. Since it is impossible to transport this down the space elevator, although I have sold this to you, you can only use it in Celestial Trade. If you want to try hard landing, take out the parts from the wreck and study it. That's fine too. Celestial Trade will revoke your safety qualification certificate. If you want to buy it later, I will not sell it to you. As for reverse engineering, when the technology is separated by a large enough gap, even if I sold the prototype to you, you must have that theoretical foundation to study it. Zhang Chen thought he was a genius. Celestial Trade will not need to pay a single cent, and all the risks are borne by his international friends. In the future, Future Heavy Industries will only increase its production capacity, producing transport ships, mining ships and space stations. Future Mining will constantly process the ores mined in its ore processing units. If these 9 asteroids are all developed by Future Mining, then even with 10 times the size, Future Mining will not be able to develop all of them. But if other countries joined, 9 more asteroids as big as Bennu will not be enough. While Celestial Trade gave up some, it gained more in return. Not only that, Celestial Trade can use other people's money to improve its own production capacity. Where could Celestial Trade find a better deal than this? 1. The Cullinan Diamond was the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found. Chapter 1000 Moscow Trip. The 2019 Celestial Trade Outer Space Resource Development Plan was like a giant rock tossed into the middle of a quiet lake. Investors from different countries flocked in along with the immigrants. Xin welcomed its third immigration wave, and the scale was far greater than the previous 2 waves, even surpassing the sum of the previous 2. More houses were being built in Celestial City, but the city still couldn't catch up to the population growth. With the increase in the development of space resources, new industries were born and new gadgets appeared in the market in this city, floating around the synchronous orbit every day. Those who originally held a pessimistic view of the commercial value of the space elevator put down their dignity and poured into Xin. Anyone could see the business opportunities and broad prospects. If Xin was only an ideal immigrant country a year ago, it was now a paradise for immigrants. Talents from all walks of life could find a suitable job in Celestial City, even if they didn't know how to do anything before. After half a year of training in the Astronaut Training Center on Ainge Island, they could even pilot a spacecraft on the geosynchronous orbit. These immigrants were not only from Hua but also from the other side of the globe, such as Canada, the United Kingdom, nearby Southeast Asia and distant Russia. Police drones helped to maintain order. These immigrants from all over the world didn't ruin the security of Xin. Instead, they brought their culture to the new country and contributed to the diversification and compatibility of the country's diverse culture. It wasn't just grassroots movement but also international capital. After the development forum, Private companies already had a taste of the opportunities available. With approval from their government, public institutions linked to the aerospace sector also joined in. They had begun to develop their own space technology with the help of the Space Elevator platform. Everyone wanted to participate, and no one wanted to lag behind in the undeveloped space. Zhang Yaping didn't have time to feel bothered by election campaigns. Actions were always stronger than words. Celestial Trade took control of his election work, and instead, he spent all day with the diplomats of different countries to obtain more benefits for Celestial Trade. While he was busy, his days were quite enjoyable. He just attended the banquet of the Russian embassy the day before. Today, he was chatting with the ambassador in a private hall. On the evening of April 20th, a private jet landed at Moscow International Airport under the mask of night. There was no grand ceremony and there were no crowded reporters, but the Kremlin welcomed this special and distinguished visitor with the highest diplomatic etiquette. Surrounded by several burly and hairy men, Zhang Chen sat in a black long limousine. He couldn't tell the name of the vehicle from the outside, but the lavishness inside made him think about purchasing one for himself. While pondering it, a security department agent had already respectfully opened the door for him. Other than the Russian foreign minister, Zhang Chen also saw an unexpected person. "Oh, you came to pick me up. I thought you were doing damage on the Russian border." It was Natasha. She was wearing a lady's suit. Her long blonde hair was tied into a ponytail and she looked quite formal. The only thing that wasn't too formal was probably her bulging chest. Zhang Chen had only not seen her for half a month, yet he felt it already got bigger. The buttons on the white shirt seemed to be crying in agony, ready to explode at any second. But for some odd reason, her waist still looked so thin. Eastern Europeans' body proportions always amazed him. Natasha didn't care about Zhang Chen staring at her chest, but she expressed a considerable degree of dissatisfaction with his first sentence, and she retorted back, "Let me correct one point. Intelligence gathering and causing destruction are two different things. Please don't take the nature of my work and..." Ahem. The Russian who was sitting directly across from him coughed, and Natasha quickly closed her mouth. Zhang Chen sat next to Natasha and examined the man across from him. Of course, he knew the identity of the foreign minister, but what alerted him was that from his attitude, Natasha's identity didn't seem so simple either. At least, unlike ordinary intelligence agents. "Welcome to Moscow, Mr. Zhang. My full name is very long. According to the language habits of the Han people, you can call me Smirnov." Unlike his burly appearance, the voice of Mr. Smirnov was courteous, and his standard Mandarin was good enough for him to be an announcer. He seemed to be a natural at diplomacy. "I am Zhang Chen." Zhang Chen smiled, shook his hand, and began to chat. The two didn't discuss any work in the car and just chatted about all things. Smirnov was an interesting person. While he didn't talk much, he could talk about many topics. They discussed football, gold, then went on about fishing. Even if Smirnov didn't know some of the things, he could use clever language techniques to not make Zhang Chen feel bored. And Natasha, sitting next to Zhang Chen, just felt invisible. Maybe it was because of her identity, but aside from her first sentence, she didn't speak anymore. It wasn't until the car was parked at the door of a five-star hotel that Smirnov mentioned the important affair. In addition to the special security team of the Russian security service responsible for the peripheral work, on this trip in Moscow, Miss Natasha will be your security consultant. Whether it's in life or work, if you encounter any inconveniences, you can consult her. Don't be polite. This is my job. Natasha squeezed her eyebrows at Zhang Chen. It was the second sentence she said. "Don't worry, I won't be polite with you. You've been drinking and eating at my house for so long. If I don't bother you, I'll be missing out on an opportunity big time." Natasha grinned. Zhang Chen then looked at Smirnov again. "I don't know when you're going to start the official discussion with us. I'm free anytime, but I hope it's not too late. In 3 days at the latest, we will arrange for you to meet with an important person as soon as possible. It's because he's currently on the front lines and can't come back immediately. I hope you can understand." Smirnov replied. "No hurry. I will stay here for a while. I'm always free. After a few words, Smirnov said goodbye to Zhang Chen. Accompanied by Natasha and security personnel, Zhang Chen stepped into this five-star hotel. However, at the door of the presidential suite where he was staying, only Natasha followed behind him. Zhang Chen took off his suit and tossed the tie aside. He then languidly took some champagne from the fridge and nonchalantly asked Natasha, "Can you tell me what you're planning to discuss with me?" "I'm sorry, I don't know the exact details. This is top secret. I can only reveal one point and it's related to the situation in Europe." Zhang Chen nodded and didn't make it difficult for Natasha. He then headed to the bathroom door. As he was about to take off his clothes to take a shower, he suddenly stopped and looked at Natasha on the sofa. "I'm going to rest soon." "You're not going back to your room?" She was amused by Zhang Chen and her bright red lips grinned. Natasha was leaning on the sofa drinking and didn't have intentions to move at all. She gracefully crossed her legs. "My room? It's here."